In California, a child's life is taken in the blink of an eye.
All right in there? Oh my God.
A puzzling crime scene leaves police with little evidence and terrifying questions.
Dark hair.
The prosecution's case rests inside the mind of a vicious killer as they seek justice for a parent's worst nightmare. Oceanside, California is a resort town known for its relaxed atmosphere and lovely beaches. But in 1998, this small California town was ripped apart by a vicious murder. Prosecutor David Rubin was charged with making sense of the terrifying crime.
A lot of the murders I've handled have had, robbery as a motive, or something as a motive where I can point to it and say, ladies and gentlemen, he did this because he wanted the radio, or he did it because he wanted the car, he wanted the whatever. But to have someone who went out to kill just for the sake of killing, that was different.
A few weeks before Thanksgiving, on November 14th, 1998, the Gerhardt clan had gathered in the resort town of Oceanside, California for a family reunion. Sharon Chey had made the 400-mile flight from her home near Sacramento with her 9-year-old son, Matthew.
I need to go to the bathroom.
Matthew and his cousins had been playing on the beach as his aunts and uncles were cleaning up after their picnic dinner. It was just before 8 o'clock when he told his aunt he had to go to the bathroom and dashed into the public restroom. A few seconds later, she followed behind him. She heard gasping noises beyond the wall of the bathroom, and a young man rushed past her. When she ran inside, she found Matthew bleeding. He had been attacked. Matthew's uncle and cousins came running. Someone ran to get the boy's mother, Sharon. They discovered Matthew on the floor, his throat slashed.
What happened?
Matthew's uncle called the Oceanside Police emergency line. This is the actual tape recording.
Oceanside PD.
Yes, I need a plea. I need an ambulance or a helicopter right now. We're at Oceanside Harbor. Someone stabbed my little nephew. I need you to take something clean, and I need you to lay something on his throat to try to control that bullet breathing, but don't press too hard.
Within minutes, paramedics arrived as his uncle was attempting to revive him. But even their fast work and expertise could not save Matthew. He was pronounced dead on the scene. When police arrived, they began by interviewing Matthew's aunt. She told them she was outside the restroom as an unknown young man ran out. She described him as short, thin, with white skin and brown hair. A complete stranger. Amazingly, she saw the man again when she ran out to get help, but he disappeared in a parking lot. Just another young man with brown hair. Oceanside Police issued an all-points bulletin to the surrounding districts and sealed off the immediate area. They combed the beach, looking for anything that could point to the identity of Matthew's attacker. The next morning, police contacted the district attorney's office. Investigator Terry Jensen was assigned to assist the police in the case.
There was just not a lot of physical evidence at the crime scene, so finding witnesses, finding little pieces of this puzzle was crucial at this particular time. There was no suspect, there was no information that at that point in time was going to help them solve this case. So they were looking for anything.
A command center was set up in a trailer on the beach. Police officers fanned out to scour the area looking for any clue to lead them to the killer. They used metal detectors to search for the murder weapon. Because this was such a random, violent crime and the suspect was still on the loose, Prosecutor David Rubin joined Jensen at the scene.
But I just was not prepared for what I saw. There's just no way to prepare for that. We walk in this basically white bathroom and it's just sprayed with blood. You know, you want this person off the streets. Here's someone who has randomly killed a young boy for the thrill of it. This is someone we need to get arrested and we need to get him prosecuted.
To prosecute the killer, police first had to find him. They hoped he had left behind some clue at the crime scene. But police were having trouble determining what took place inside the bathroom. They hoped the story could be read in the blood evidence.
We need an expert to tell us as much information as we can get from this scene, from these blood spatters, what happened. We knew Matthew was dead. We knew that he was laying on the floor. Who, how, what happened? We needed a story. We needed something to help us figure out what happened.
After working the scene for 24 hours, investigators flew in Brian Kennedy, a blood spatter expert based in Northern California. He has spent 20 years studying the physics of murder, reading clues written in blood at crime scenes.
You know, they had the 9-year-old boy with his throat slit. Psychologically, it terrorizes the investigator. The investigator wants to know as much as they possibly can to solve this. The investigator feels anxiety for the survivors of the child. They feel their own inner emotions because they have children. They needed to know what had happened.
The story began to unfold to Brian Kennedy as he documented the scene.
Well, it was quite obvious that the wound that this child had suffered was potentially fatal from the instant. The arterial hemorrhage that covered the wall was overwhelming.
From the pattern of the blood, Kennedy deduced that Matthew had died instantly while he was standing up. Kennedy told the police the suspect was right-handed, that he came from behind with the knife and possibly held the wound open to bleed out as fast as possible. The autopsy confirmed Kennedy's findings. The medical examiner found a single surgical cut that severed the jugular veins and the right carotid artery, made with a double-edged knife. Police decided not to make public an additional injury: 5 stab wounds to Matthew's upper back.
It is generally the practice of every police agency not to release all of the information, so that you do have like a trump card sitting there so that only the individual that could have done this crime could tell you this particular piece of information.
It was a shocking story, and sorrow for the family poured out from communities all over California in the form of vigils and memorials. It also created an overwhelming sense of fear. Matthew was out of the sight of his family for mere seconds. And then he was gone. It was every parent's worst nightmare.
And there was a lot of panic from the community. You know, people take their kids to shopping malls, to beaches, and their children go into the bathrooms. What can a parent do to ever prevent this? And really the answer is there's nothing. And that's a very helpless feeling when you know that there is nothing you could possibly have done.
Investigators did what they could to find this killer. But they had no idea who he was or what he would do next. He seemed to have vanished. And indeed, he was, at that moment, boarding a bus to Los Angeles, where he would be free to hunt again. On Monday, November 16th, 1998, 2 days after the murder of Matthew Chey, the city of Los Angeles was hiding his murderer. At 6:30 in the morning, 40-year-old Maria Luisa Rosales was on her way to work at a Los Angeles sewing factory when a young man with a backpack approached her. But when she stopped to answer his question, he attacked her. Luckily, her co-workers arrived and saw the attack. A woman screamed for help. It was happening so fast, the witnesses thought the young man was beating her with his fists. Another co-worker saw the commotion and rushed to help. The attacker saw he was outnumbered and tried to flee, but he was cornered. Surrounded by the three men, he dropped the knife and crumpled to the ground, pleading with the men not to touch him. They used his belt to bind his hands until officers arrived. Their quick action had saved Maria's life. Police found the subject sitting calmly on the ground. He said his name was Brandon Wilson and claimed it was all a mistake, that he too was chasing the attacker and the men grabbed him instead. But this time, there were witnesses to his bloody attack. The officers were mystified why Wilson attacked a total stranger. But when he started to talk, they contacted Oceanside District Attorney David Rubin.
The detectives up at LAPD in their Hollywood division asked him during the interview, had he ever done an attack like the one they had in Los Angeles before, and he just volunteered that yes, he had in Oceanside a couple of nights before he had killed a little boy. They called Oceanside Police Department to confirm that that was true, that that had occurred. They had some details from him that were not released to the press, so they knew that they had the right guy or someone who knew everything about this murder.
Although the young man's appearance didn't match the description of the Oceanside suspect, Wilson claimed he had stabbed Matthew 5 times in the back after slitting his throat. This was one of the details that only the killer could have known. Oceanside police immediately drove to Los Angeles to pick Wilson up and bring him in for questioning. Brandon Wilson was in custody that afternoon, only 2 days after the murder. And to their surprise, he was ready and willing to tell them anything they wanted to know. On video, on the record. Unsure of what Wilson might say, the prosecution made certain they were present.
While they're driving up there, I've already been told that this is occurring, and we arranged to meet at Oceanside Police Department, representatives of my office, so we can observe the interview as it occurs.
These are the actual videotapes of Brandon Wilson's confession to Detective McDonough of the Oceanside Police Department.
And what was your intent?
To kill.
To find a victim. To find a victim.
Right.
So you were hunting.
Exactly.
When Detective McDonough asked him why, Wilson claimed a voice told him to do it.
When people die and they have not attained enlightenment, they don't die. They come back. So when I kill them, I'm letting them be born again.
So you place yourself in a God position.
Yes.
Would that be accurate?
Yes.
So you feel, go ahead.
More like a devil position, but still.
Investigator Jensen from the DA's office realized they might be facing a case of legal insanity. The investigation would now move from simple physical evidence to more complicated psychological evidence.
As we're watching Brandon, not only his demeanor in the interview room, how he's answering the questions, some of the things that he's saying, some of the comments that he's making about God and other aspects of the case, caused us to realize, very early on in the interview, that one of the possible defenses was going to be the issue of insanity.
There's those people that are lambs, right? I'm the lion, right? And they're the lambs, okay? They're there for me to kill them, okay? They're happy. I'm not. I don't have the ability to be happy anymore. I gave that up. Why did I give that up? Doesn't everybody want to be happy? I gave it up. Why did I do it? So other people can be happy.
So you consider yourself a martyr?
Absolutely.
Okay, what's your cause?
Life. Love.
Does he hang out in Oceanside?
The prosecutors believed Wilson was unbalanced.
He's not doing that. He's not.
They began to try and determine whether he understood the difference between right and wrong.
We got in there asking him questions about right and wrong, because right and wrong is a critical part of the test for is somebody sane or insane in California.
Yeah, it was serrated on one side.
But Wilson gave conflicting answers. Yes, he knew society would think murder was wrong, but society didn't understand his mission.
Tell me what you believe right and wrong is.
The same thing.
Explain it.
There's no difference between right and wrong.
Okay, help me understand that.
Everything's right.
The prosecutor began to direct the detective questioning Wilson. They were looking for something in Wilson's past that might give them a clue to his state of mind.
Yeah, I don't know.
We wanted his biography. So at one point we said, go back in and start him talking about himself so we can start tracking his travels and tracking where he's grown up.
Wilson told police he had done a lot of drugs as a teenager. And though he had the grades to go to college, instead he jumped from job to job in his hometown of LaCroix, Wisconsin. He said he left home the day after his 20th birthday, financing his travels with an insurance settlement from a car accident. Wilson traveled west for a few months to Seattle, Colorado, Oregon. He described himself as shy, antisocial. He was also taking a lot of hallucinogenic drugs. He said he was camping alone in the California desert one night and took 5 times the normal dose of LSD. Then he had an epiphany, which he explained to police.
I figured out everything. I figured out love and what I have to do to get that. Right? Right? What I'm talking about.
I'm with you.
And so I knew what I had to do. So I was like, okay, I'm in this really small town. I wasn't yet thinking that I actually wanted to get caught. Right? So I was like, okay, I'm going to go to Oceanside and do it. Because there's more people. It'll slip through the cracks, right?
Wilson claimed he suddenly knew that he was supposed to kill. He had the realization that it was his job to balance good and evil by committing a murder. Wilson, having abandoned his car a month earlier, boarded a bus for Oceanside. In his own words, on the night of the murder, he was a hunter, looking for the perfect, pure victim. Though he passed a couple of women on the beach, he said he decided not to kill them. Then he saw the Gerhardt cousins on the beach playground.
Bam. This is it. This is it. This is it. This is the one. Follow them.
I need to go to the bathroom.
No. You're 5 minutes from home. You can wait.
I'm going anywhere.
Stand up. Sit backing away, and here's your mother's voice.
To Prosecutor Rubin, Brandon Wilson's actions did not seem like those of an insane man. Wilson was in complete control when he took Matthew Chey's life.
He is quick and almost surgical about this strike against little Matthew. I mean, this is a one slit of this kid's throat. I mean, this was just, he knew exactly what he was doing.
And what else?
In my view of it, we have someone who is a thrill killer.
After Wilson's interrogation, the Oceanside police retraced the confessed killer's steps, including his motel room, to get the forensic corroboration they would need for the prosecutor's case.
In the search of Brandon Wilson's hotel room where he had stayed, they found blood in the pipes underneath the sink.
Get that. Get a bag, tag this.
It was obvious that Brandon Wilson had shaved his head after the murder. Detectives visited local barbershops to talk with anyone who might have seen him. Hairdresser Lorraine Vulich remembered Wilson because of his unusual reaction.
He never looked in the mirror, never touched his head, and usually when you do bald haircuts, you know, it's that drastic. They'll at least make a joke about it, or they'll touch their head, at least turn around and look in the mirror, because when we do haircuts, we face them backwards. Then he just got up and paid the cashier, you know, with his change, and then left.
Then Wilson boarded a bus north to Los Angeles, only to attack again. Investigator Jensen pored over the evidence police collected. Police from the LAPD gave them the knife Wilson used to stab Maria Rosales. Jensen suspected it was the same knife that killed Matthew Chey. In Wilson's hotel room, they found some books, including a book of mythology. Jensen was looking for any evidence supporting the prosecution's assertion that Brandon Wilson was sane, and he killed simply for the thrill of it. He flew to Seattle to see if any of Wilson's friends could shed light on Wilson's state of mind.
We were able to find out in some of the interviews that he had thought about killing animals, that he had thought about killing before. When the interview with his brother and an interview with a friend up in Seattle, Washington, he talked about what it would be like to see death, to look someone in the eye as they were dying and stare death right in the face.
Or even fascinated with
Brandon Wilson had become obsessed with facing death. While police continued gathering evidence, Prosecutor David Rubin assembled his team and began working on the formal charges.
Because we had a confession, it was no longer a whodunit. It was a what is it? What degree of murder is this?
The prosecution decided to seek charges of first-degree murder with the special circumstances of lying in wait. Those special circumstances, if proven, made Brandon Wilson eligible for the death penalty in the state of California. Shortly before the arraignment, the court appointed Wilson a lawyer. Kurt Owen was part of a high-profile team of public defenders specializing in capital cases. In Owen's first meeting with his client, he found Wilson a mystery.
When I first met Brandon, he was a very quiet, polite, intelligent young man. I could not put him together with the accusations and what I knew had apparently happened. It seemed very normal to me at the time.
At Wilson's first hearing on the murder charge, Owen was in for a shock. After he pled not guilty on his client's behalf, Wilson took matters into his own hands in front of a courtroom packed with television cameras.
I did it. I killed him. I killed the little boy.
Wilson's lawyer tried to stop his new client from talking.
I'm trying to keep him quiet because he just made what's known as a judicial confession in front of 8 television cameras and 4 still cameras, which is going to make the case a little difficult to deal with. But at that point, the judge entered the plea and sent us out.
Wilson was back in court a week later, this time much subdued. Owen began with the only defense he could. If he wanted to save his client's life, he would have to try and prove Brandon Wilson was insane.
There was nothing that Brandon could gain. It was not robbery, it was not sex, it was not revenge. This was a totally clinical selection of an unknown person to offer as a sacrifice to God. And it seemed to me that any juror is going to look at that, is going to have questions in their own mind as to whether or not this person Brandon, was at all sane. The whole point was to use the incident itself to illustrate that this is just crazy conduct. You can't explain it any other way.
In a court of law, insanity is not a scientific or a moral state. In California, it has a clear legal definition. And from the beginning, the prosecutors knew their mission would be to prove that Wilson was a child murderer who was sane. Brandon Wilson was in custody within 2 days of the murder of 9-year-old Matthew Chey.
It is odd, actually. It is, but it's the way things are. I didn't do it. I didn't.
Wilson confessed, claiming he got a message telling him to kill. His guilt was not in question. His sanity was.
And correct me if I'm wrong, man.
I don't want it to be this way. I wish it wasn't, but it is.
Okay.
On January 14th, 1999, Wilson entered 2 pleas before the court. Guilty and not guilty by reason of insanity, opening the door for a sanity hearing where a jury would ultimately decide if he would face the death penalty or be sentenced to a hospital for the criminally insane.
What happens on a sanity trial is that the defense goes first because they have the burden of proving that their client is insane.
Determining Wilson's sanity now was up to the forensic psychiatrists. Wilson was examined, analyzed, and given a battery of tests by a total of 5 mental health professionals.
What would you think it sounded like? It was God.
Legal insanity is a defense of last resort, used in a small percentage of cases because it is rarely successful.
It wasn't either.
The definition is not scientific, it is legal. Dr. Charles Rabner, independent of the defense and the prosecution, was one of the psychiatrists appointed by the court.
Mr. Wilson.
The state of California is interested in knowing what his mind was at the time. Did he know what he was doing was wrong? And if he did know it was wrong, could he have stopped himself if he tried hard enough? Essentially, that's it.
In order to determine his mental state, the psychiatrist studied everything from his sense of reality to possible brain damage.
Now,
They were given the opportunity to study the Oceanside interrogation tape.
Artificial control.
Detective McDonough's questions about right and wrong became the focal point of the psychiatrist's evaluation.
Can't do that, that's just putting it off. Okay. Now, do you feel you have pretty good control of yourself? Yeah. Okay. Do you consciously know what you're doing when you do it? Yes. Okay. Do you know the difference between right and wrong? I do. Give me an example. Okay. How did you... Is killing this boy right or wrong?
Do you know how long it would take to explain?
As the trial began, Wilson's use of LSD was discussed, as well as past psychiatric records.
my opinion was that although he suffered...
Dr. Rabner submitted to the court that Wilson's delusions didn't force him to kill Matthew, only justified it for him.
Nothing to prevent him from knowing or understanding.
Rabner's conclusion was that Brandon Wilson understood the nature of his act and killed because he wanted to. Defense attorney Kurt Owen hired expert Dr. Donna Zimmerman to examine Wilson.
My opinion is that Mr. Wilson...
She found evidence that Wilson was indeed insane.
...affective disorder. It's a combination of...
She felt that Brandon Wilson suffered from a psychotic disorder, which made him incapable of distinguishing between right and wrong.
What he'd done was wrong. And...
But testimony from a nationally famous expert for the prosecution, Dr. Park Dietz, was substantially different. On the stand, Dietz used the events following Matthew's murder to prove his assertion that Wilson knew full well what was right and wrong.
What does that kind of tell us?
He continued to flee and at one point saw what he believed was an approaching police car, at which point he dove into a culvert in order to hide from the advancing lights and not be observed. When what he thought was a police car had passed, he then continued fleeing to the hotel, his motel room, and as soon as possible he got inside his motel room. He washed his hands, he washed the blood off the knife. So all of those aspects of flight, of trying not to be captured immediately, are an indication of his knowing that what he'd done was wrong.
Dietz went on to explain how the act of Wilson getting a haircut demonstrated his need to disguise himself, again demonstrating that he knew what he had done was wrong.
It's actually important that he acknowledged that he knew society would regard his actions as wrong, despite his having the opinion that they were somehow justified. That a defendant's merely having the personal opinion that what they're doing is right does not make it so if they recognize that society would condemn what they're doing.
Dietz also did not lend credence to the defense assertion that Wilson was mentally ill and could not understand right and wrong.
What's not true is that just because someone is sick, they're not responsible. The law requires not just that somebody be sick, but also that that sickness made them unable to know what they were doing or unable to know it was wrong.
Matthew Chey had
the jury was getting an array of opinions, 5 different experts. Soon they would have to decide whom to believe and whether or not Wilson belonged in a hospital or a jail cell.
You solemnly swear that the testimony you're about to give in the matter now pending before this
As the
court
trial
shall
to
be the
determine
truth,
his
whole
sanity
truth,
neared
and
its
nothing but the truth,
conclusion,
so help you God.
Brandon Wilson took
Thank
the
you. Please come
stand.
forward and take a seat in the witness stand.
He wanted to plead his own case. His defense attorney, Kurt Owen, hoped that his own words would reveal his insanity to the jury. Owen began asking Brandon Wilson about his past. Brandon said he had a happy, normal childhood in a small town in Wisconsin. But at the age of 13, he became a pawn of his parents' divorce. At that point, he started taking drugs. He isolated himself from his friends and holed up in his room reading philosophy and mythology. He had even been arrested for attempting to steal a car and had other run-ins with the law, including the vandalizing of a graveyard and playing mailbox baseball. Wilson explained on the stand how he tried to escape the anger with LSD.
Yes.
This is going to sound strange to you, okay?
Hit me.
I believe that if I would have killed my mother when I was 16 years old, that the world could have ended in the year 2000, and we could all be free from this. We wouldn't have to suffer. I believe that because I didn't do it, we're all going to suffer for another 1,000 years.
Wilson explained to the jury how he left home on his 20th birthday to travel and try and figure out what he wanted to do with his life. It was on this trip that he realized that he had an evil side which had been placed in him for one reason: to kill someone. In his closing arguments, prosecutor David Rubin characterized Wilson as someone who knew that what he did was wrong and killed for pleasure.
And he goes out. And we know by his actions, no matter how you approach this case, that he knows the nature and quality of the act. He understands the nature and quality of the act. And he can distinguish between right and wrong. Right and wrong because he knows it was legally wrong and he knew it was morally wrong, as we, a community, see that. That's what I told you in opening statement 2 weeks ago. I think this evidence more than proves this. Defendant Wilson is sane, and I'm asking you to so find. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rubin.
Defense attorney Kurt Owen used his closing arguments to rebut the prosecution and assert that Wilson was incapable of grasping right and wrong.
Mr. Rubin and I apparently completely disagree on where the battlefield in this case lies. It is not, I think I've said this before, whether the defendant appreciated that the objective standard of right and wrong, both morally and legally, society's standard, said what he was doing was wrong, both morally and legally. The point is that he did not and could not understand the moral nature and quality of the act.
The case now rested in the hands of the jury. After deliberating for 2 days, on September 28, 1999, the jury returned with a decision.
We, the jury, in the above entitled cause, find the defendant, Brandon H. Wilson, was sane at the time of the commission of the crimes charged in the information, namely murder in the first degree in violation.
Prosecutors were gratified by the decision, but their work was far from over. They would now have to argue that Wilson deserved the ultimate punishment, death. And for that, the prosecutor would have to lay out the horrifying details of Matthew's murder and the effect on the loved ones left behind.
He will be brought in by God to the inner circle of law.
Up against this horror, Wilson's defense attorney spared nothing to try to save the life of a young man he believed was seriously mentally ill and deserved mercy. Brandon Wilson had been declared sane. Because he admitted in court he killed 9-year-old Matthew Chey, he had to face one more trial, a proceeding to decide his punishment. Because Matthew was ambushed by his murderer, Brandon Wilson was eligible for the death penalty.
Be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God. Thank you. Please
The jurors would now hear the testimony of the family Matthew Chey left behind. Prosecutor Rubin called Matthew's mother Sharon to the stand.
Please state your full name and spell your last name.
He asked her to describe her son for the jury.
He liked to draw a lot. He said he wanted to be an engineer or a cartoonist or an architect.
All right. And was he creative?
Very creative.
Tell us about that.
He used to like to make things out of things around the house, you know. Paper towel rolls, cans. He used to like to make robots, and he used to write stories about aliens, and he just had a great imagination.
You know, maybe we have a quick sidebar on something I'd like to mark.
As Sharon Chey was overtaken by her emotions, Rubin paused. The answers to his next line of questioning would weigh heavily on all who heard them.
Probably the most difficult time in the whole trial for me was when Matthew's mother, Sharon Chey, got up on the stand and testified and had to tell about what she saw that night.
Yes.
And when you got into the bathroom, what did you see?
I ran into the bathroom, and Matt was on the floor, lying down on his back on the floor, and he had a gray jacket up to his neck, and there was blood all over the walls.
What did you do?
I kneeled down next to him, and I put my hands on his hair, and I said, "Matt, it's Mom. I'm here. Hang in there, baby. I love you."
Did you try to give him CPR as well?
Yes.
Okay. And what did you do to give him CPR?
I breathed in his mouth, I think twice.
Okay, did you see any reaction at all?
Yes.
What did you see?
I saw blood come out of the side of his mouth, and I saw his eyes roll on the back of his head.
Again, I think at the time you thought that might be a good sign.
I didn't know. I didn't see his throat. I didn't know that he was so badly injured.
When Sharon Chey, Matthew's mom, got off the stand and came out of the courtroom, I was the first person that she saw. And she fell into my arms, almost such a relief, and just cried, just wept. And that was probably the most difficult time I have had in my career as a law enforcement officer.
Brandon Wilson then approached the stand.
Please state your full name and spell your last name for the record.
Brandon H. Wilson, W-I-L-S-O-N.
He wanted to speak on his own behalf. Kurt Owen tried to stop him, fearing he would talk himself into the death penalty. But Wilson's obsession with death could not be contained.
Yes.
He demanded to make a statement,
I have advised you
uninterrupted.
not to make a statement. Is that correct?
That's correct.
You wish to disregard my advice and make a statement anyway?
I do.
What is that statement, sir?
First of all, I'd like to say that I feel no remorse whatsoever for what I've done. I would do it again in a second if I had the chance. I've explained to you my position here. My whole purpose in life is to help destroy your society. You people are here as representatives of that society, and as such, you should do everything in your power to rid the world of me.
Thank you.
Execute me.
Thank you. That will be sufficient.
Mr. Rubin, any questions?
No, Your Honor.
You may step down, Mr. Wilson. Both counsel, Mr. Wilson's present, Mr. Owen.
Families.
In closing, Kurt Owen begged the jury to show mercy and put Wilson in prison where he could be treated for his mental delusions.
From the beginning, the question has always been, why? Why? How could it happen? But there is treatment available for mental illness within the California Department of Corrections. Treatment that might well restore Brandon Wilson to the Brandon Wilson that used to live in Wisconsin. For this is a heartbreaking case. And your lives are never going to be the same either. Your lives are never going to be the same. You didn't ask for this job, but you were selected by Mr. Rubin and by me because we felt that you could take upon yourselves this incredible burden of trying to decide between life and death for Mr. Wilson. Now, there is no
The defense argued that with a sentence of life in prison, Brandon Wilson could be treated for his mental illness.
So what?
But prosecutor David Rubin argued that treatment for Brandon Wilson was not the issue.
This defendant was at the time. So he's treatable. So what? We're not here to determine if he's treatable. We're here to determine what's the punishment here. What do we do with him? What do you want to say to him? I mean, here's a fact.
On October 6th, the jury of 12 people came back with its unanimous decision. Brandon Wilson was sentenced to death. After asking the court to execute him, the jury granted Brandon Wilson's request. For Terry Jensen, the verdict was a sign the system worked.
Justice took care of Brandon Wilson. He will never hurt anybody again. That Matthew and his family, justice served them. Society, justice served them. And that personally, for me as an investigator, that I did everything that I could possibly do to make sure that the system worked.
Brandon Wilson sits on death row in California's San Quentin prison. It will be years before he faces his ultimate penalty and stares death in the face. An execution-style murder shocks a secluded Los Angeles community. Detectives uncover a trail of money and blood from Hollywood to Mexico. When prime suspects, one by one, start turning up dead, the prosecutors begin to fear that a mastermind killer will never be brought to justice. On December 9, 1988, a Hollywood cameraman was found murdered in his Southern California home. It would take investigators more than 5 years to bring a suspect to trial. Prosecutor Janice Morisi would attempt to find justice in the aftermath of this brutal crime.
When you prosecute cases and you see the crime scene photos and you see the horror of what has actually happened and you see the devastation and you meet the family members and you see these things happening in the community that you live in, and the victims and the victims' families are real people, you have a sense of a need to make sure that justice is done.
In this episode, some of the names of family members and witnesses have been changed to protect their identities. A few weeks before Christmas 1988, in the secluded neighborhood of Sepulveda, a few miles north of Hollywood, Los Angeles police investigate a homicide.
Let me know when his last meal was and what he had.
A man named Robert Samuels was found shot to death in his home. The victim's wife, Mary Ellen Samuels, told investigators that she and her daughter Melissa had stopped by her husband's house to drop off their dog. They discovered Robert lying dead on the floor. It appeared that the victim had been about to walk into a room containing a tanning bed when he was attacked.
It's all in there. Yeah.
Although there seemed to be some minor property damage inside the house, detectives observed there were no signs of forced entry and no signs of burglary. Mary Ellen Samuel's best friend, Anne Marie Hambley, arrived at Robert's home to console her grieving friend. She too was interviewed, but could give investigators no information about the crime. Detective George Daly was assigned to head the murder investigation. One of his first tasks would be to eliminate the family members as suspects.
In most cases of murder, I would say 85% or more of the time, the murderer or conspirators are someone who the victim knows.
Mary Ellen's daughter Melissa was given a gunshot residue test. This procedure detects any gunpowder residue on an individual who has recently discharged a firearm. Mary Ellen Samuels also agreed to be tested. The results for both mother and daughter were negative. Neither had recently fired a weapon. That night, Mary Ellen agreed to visit the police station. Investigators wanted to know if Robert might have known his attacker, or if Mary Ellen knew of anyone who might have a reason to kill him. She told investigators that she and her husband had been separated for 2 years and were on friendly terms. She mentioned several people who might have held grudges against her husband, but her theories provided no substantial leads. An autopsy revealed that Samuels suffered blunt force trauma to his head prior to being shot. It was an immediate, disabling injury. The gunshot that killed Samuels was fired mere inches from his head, approximately 12 to 24 hours before the body's discovery.
Where was the entry point?
The entry point came right through the eyes. He shot right through the head, through the pillow.
Fragments extracted from the victim revealed that a 16-gauge shotgun had been used in the attack.
We don't exactly know when the time.
The blast had been fired through a pillow placed over the victim's head after he had been struck to the floor. The killing appeared to be the cold-blooded act of an assassin. News of Samuel's death spread quickly. Robert Samuels was a well-respected camera technician and had worked on such films as Heaven Can Wait, Lethal Weapon 2, and The Color Purple. Detective Daly had little to go on. There were no fingerprints, no fiber or hair evidence at the scene, and no eyewitnesses. He next turned to the victim's family and paid a visit to Robert Samuel's sister. Susan Conroy provided a detailed background of her brother's relationship with his wife, Mary Ellen. Robert had been infatuated with Mary Ellen since elementary school.
How much to gain from this?
But it was not until years later, after her first marriage ended, that the two became reacquainted,
Let me ask you one little question.
fell in love, and eventually married.
I'm sure
Together, they raised Mary Ellen's daughter.
and I'm sure.
But in 1987, Mary Ellen took her daughter and abruptly moved
And
out.
left him a Dear John letter.
You have any idea
Robert,
who that is?
Conroy said, was devastated.
That's maybe one of Nicole when she was.
Though they were separated, the couple continued to operate a sandwich shop they owned in Van Nuys. Now, with Robert's death,
Miss Samuels?
Mary Ellen was the sole owner. Several days after the shooting, Detective Daly visited Mary Ellen at the sandwich shop.
Just take me a few minutes.
The detective requested a list of her employees for routine interviews in the investigation. Mary Ellen promised to provide the list. She also agreed to visit the police station to take a polygraph test.
In your prior lifetime,
Investigators told Mary Ellen the test was routine.
No.
It was necessary to exclude her as a possible suspect. She was asked if she participated in the shooting of her husband. She said she did not. She was asked if she knew who killed her husband. And again, she said no. The polygraph administrator determined that Mary Ellen Samuels had answered the questions truthfully. "30 days after the murder, Daly received a call from an insurance company. The insurance investigator asked if Mary Ellen Samuels was a suspect in the homicide investigation. As Robert Samuels' widow, she was listed as the beneficiary of policies totaling more than $500,000. Daly learned that Robert Samuels' insurance policies would pay off the mortgages on the sandwich shop and his Sepulveda home, and that Mary Ellen would inherit both properties. Daly informed the insurance agent that he had no evidence connecting her to the murder.
No.
Since she was not a suspect, the agent explained, the insurance company would begin to process her claims. The total value of the policies would exceed $600,000. Several months passed without a single lead, and the investigation was officially classified as a cold case. But Daly refused to give up, although he knew that as time passed, the likelihood of solving the crime would become more and more remote. He received his first break in the investigation when a friend of Mary Ellen's, Jane Stevens, came forward with new information. Jane had met Mary Ellen at a bar several months before the murder. According to Stevens, she and Mary Ellen often discussed each other's divorces.
What are you talking about?
At one point, Mary Ellen told her that she wanted Robert out of her life permanently, and she needed to borrow $10,000 to pay for a hitman. Jane had dismissed the comment, convinced that her friend's plan had been inspired by alcohol.
Probably more acquaintance.
During this interview, Jane also mentioned a man named James Bernstein.
I don't really know anything else, but
She said Bernstein worked at Mary Ellen's sandwich shop and was employed there when the murder took place.
husband, and, you know,
Daley noticed that Bernstein's name was not on the employee list that Mary Ellen had given to him. According to Jane, Bernstein was a boyfriend of Mary Ellen's daughter, Melissa. James Bernstein agreed to come into the station for questioning. In the interview, he denied any knowledge of the murder of Robert Samuels. But Daley was certain Bernstein knew more.
During my investigation, I had interrogated Mr. Bernstein on occasions, and I felt that at some point, at some future point, Mr. Bernstein would assist in solving the murder of Mr. Samuels by telling me what his part, what other part other people played in the murder.
Daley decided to take a closer look into the relationship between Bernstein and Melissa Samuels. He visited Melissa's Los Angeles high school and questioned several of her classmates. They told him about rumors that Melissa's mother, Mary Ellen, had hired a hitman to kill Robert.
If just be one more.
Detective George Daley's case was finally gaining momentum. Feeling the pressure of the investigation, Mary Ellen filed a complaint with the captain of the Los Angeles Homicide Division, charging that Daley was harassing her. The charges were never substantiated, and Daley's investigation continued undeterred. In May 1989, 5 months after the murder of Robert Samuels, Detective Daley received a call from a man identifying himself only as a friend of Melissa's. He claimed that Mary Ellen had asked him to kill her husband, but that he had turned down the request. He said that James Bernstein told him that Robert Samuel's killer was a man named Mike Silva.
I'm not telling you.
A check of police records revealed that Silva had a minor rap sheet. He lived just outside Los Angeles. After months of frustrating work, Daley had several important witnesses who claimed that Mary Ellen Samuels had planned her husband's death. But he would still need evidence to corroborate the stories. Stories that were based on hearsay, one witness who was anonymous, and a killer who, for now, was untouchable. After 5 months with no leads, Detective George Daley finally had a prime suspect in the murder of Hollywood cameraman Robert Samuels, his widow, Mary Ellen Samuels. Information from friends, associates, and an anonymous caller indicated that Mary Ellen, with the help of an employee named James Bernstein, hired a man named Mike Silva to kill her husband. But an anonymous tip would not be enough to arrest Silva. Daley would need more evidence. In order to find proof of a conspiracy, he obtained a multi-location search warrant for Mary Ellen Samuels' condominium, Mike Silva's residence, and James Bernstein's apartment. At Mary Ellen's condominium, police discovered evidence that since her husband's death, Mary Ellen had sold the sandwich shop. They found receipts and bank records showing she had made a $50,000 cash payment on a new Porsche and had spent large amounts of money on expensive lingerie, designer clothes, catered parties, and rented limousines. She had also made an offer to purchase a condominium in Cancun, Mexico. Bank records indicated the spending spree was funded by Robert's life insurance policy and the sale of the sandwich shop. But detectives still couldn't find any direct evidence linking Mary Ellen to the murder.
Yeah, this one's me.
Victoria's Secret?
Through the search warrant, police were able to subpoena her phone records. When the search of Mike Silva's residence was conducted, no evidence was recovered. The police were able to subpoena Silva's phone records. Daley suspected that Silva had been the shooter and Bernstein had been the go-between. The detective questioned Silva but got nowhere. Daley and his investigators also searched James Bernstein's apartment. When they arrived, Bernstein was not at home. They performed a cursory search and found no evidence. As a matter of procedure, Daley left behind a copy of the search warrant. Daley wanted to locate Bernstein for more questioning, but he was nowhere to be found. His apartment manager said he hadn't been seen in weeks. He said he'd heard from another tenant that Bernstein was hiding out from the police.
2 weeks that you saw him.
Daley spent hours reviewing phone records from Mary Ellen's home and the sandwich shop, as well as those of Mike Silva. He noticed that Mary Ellen and Silva had both called Bernstein on numerous occasions. To complete the conspiracy theory, Bernstein's phone records would need to reflect return calls, which they did not. Daley still did not have all the pieces he would need to make his case. Then on July 27, 1989, 7 months after the murder of Robert Samuels, Daley received a phone call from James Bernstein's apartment.
Thank you for that information. We
The caller identified himself as Ventura County Sergeant Robert McFarland. He told Daley he was at Bernstein's apartment investigating a homicide. Detective Daley rushed to the apartment and learned from McFarland that James Bernstein had been found dead in Ventura County, 100 miles north of Los Angeles. When McFarland discovered a copy of the previous search warrant posted by Detective Daley, he immediately called him. McFarland told Daley that a few weeks earlier, Ventura County Police received a report. A couple of hikers had found a mummified body in Lakewood Canyon. The Ventura County Medical Examiner's Office knew it would be difficult to identify the victim. The remains had decomposed under the dry California sun. But their autopsy report did confirm that their John Doe had been brutally strangled. His larynx had been crushed. The Ventura County Medical Examiner would try to obtain a fingerprint from the mummified hand. In the laboratory, they removed the hand and rehydrated one of the victim's fingers. They eventually succeeded in getting a single print. Running the print through a computerized fingerprint system called Cal ID, investigators caught a break. The victim had an arrest file with the police. His name was James Bernstein.
Upon learning of the death of Mr. Bernstein, my heart sank because I figured, hey, that, you know, one of our most important people in this whole investigation, or a person who we believed would become one of our most important people in this investigation, was gone.
Phone receipt books, small books, that kind of thing.
The Ventura investigators found a clue that Daly's investigative team had overlooked on their first search of the apartment. It was a simple phone card, and it would dramatically change the course of the investigation. It would help to solve the mystery of how the co-conspirators were communicating. Investigators now knew why the phone records from Bernstein's apartment did not show calls to Mary Ellen and Silva. Bernstein had placed his calls using the phone card. The unraveling of the conspiracy was nearly complete.
We discovered that a half hour before Mrs. Samuels told the police she found her husband on the floor of his Bahama Street home, that there had been a conversation between someone at James Bernstein's home, someone at Mike Silva's home, and someone at the Subway sandwich shop.
Bernstein's calling card records also showed that during the last days of his life, he had made calls from the home of Anne Marie Hambley, Mary Ellen's best friend. Detectives from Ventura County and Los Angeles decided to work together to solve both crimes, the murder of James Bernstein and the murder of Robert Samuels. They converged on Anne Marie Hambley's property. There, stored in a back shed, detectives found a bag of Bernstein's clothes. Hambley was taken in for questioning.
Miss Hambley.
It became clear that she was one of the last people to see James Bernstein alive. In order to break open the conspiracy, they offered Hambley immunity from prosecution. Sergeant Robert McFarland helped lead the Ventura County investigation of the Bernstein homicide.
Ann Hambley told us that Mary Ellen Samuels had arranged for Paul Gall and Darrell Edwards to murder James Bernstein.
Hambley's live-in boyfriend, Paul Edwin Gall, and his friend, Darrell Ray Edwards, were paid $5,000 by Mary Ellen Samuels to kill Bernstein. With Ann Hambley's testimony, the homicide investigations of both Los Angeles and Ventura County pointed directly toward one person, Mary Ellen Samuels. And the investigators knew it was time to bring her to justice. On January 26, 1990, Mary Ellen Samuels was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder, with special circumstances of multiple murder and murder for financial gain, for her role in the deaths of both Robert Samuels and James Bernstein.
Okay, sir, could you move just a little bit over to your left? Thank you.
The same day, police apprehended Paul Edwin Gall, one of the men whom Mary Ellen allegedly hired to kill James Bernstein.
Over here.
5 days later, Gall's accomplice, Darrell Ray Edwards, walked into the Foothill Police Station and surrendered.
Hands up on the wall.
Investigators looked again to question Mike Silva, the man they believed James Bernstein had hired to kill Mary Ellen Samuels' husband. They would never get that opportunity. Mike Silva was dead. He had shot his girlfriend and then turned the gun on himself.
I don't know. The last time I saw my dad with my mom was Wednesday, and I don't know when the last time he spoke to us.
police re-interviewed Mary Ellen's daughter, Melissa. But she provided no new information, and with no direct evidence implicating her in the two murders, the authorities chose not to file any charges against her.
She went to call 911.
Mary Ellen was ordered to be held without bail by the San Fernando Municipal Court.
Turn around, remove the handcuffs. Okay.
Ventura Sergeant Robert McFarland had led the investigation into the murder of James Bernstein.
The most frustrating aspect of the case was the fact that everyone we talked to, in probably 50 or 60 interviews that we conducted, knew who was responsible for the murder of James Bernstein, and they said it was Mary Ellen Samuels. But as police officers, we need a little bit more than just somebody saying that another person was involved. We need corroboration.
That corroboration would come from Paul Edwin Gall and Darrell Edwards, who faced first-degree murder charges for their roles in the slaying of James Bernstein. When the district attorney's office offered the possibility of a reduced charge, both Edwards and Gall confessed to what happened the night of Bernstein's death.
You had 4 beers and you can't remember what you did.
Gall and Edwards had convinced Bernstein to take a short road trip on the pretext of stealing some drugs.
Do the drive, man. Here you go, bud. All right.
They used one of Mary Ellen's cars for the trip. The hitmen admitted the job was messy and botched. They tried to strangle Bernstein in the car, but when he managed to escape, they pursued him.
Paul Gall jumped out of the car, came around, helped pull Bernstein down onto the pavement. Both of them got on top of him and started strangling him. At one time, they thought that he was actually dead. They got up both exhausted, and then Bernstein started to get up. They got on him again, and it finally killed him by strangling him.
In the months that followed, Detective Daly retired, and the case was passed to Deputy District Attorney Janice Morisi and her investigator, Detective Terry Richardson. Morisi knew that it would be difficult to convince the jury that Mary Ellen could have masterminded the two murders.
The more I studied the case prior to trial, the more I realized that Mary Ellen Samuels was very good at convincing people to do anything that she wanted. I mean, anybody who can convince others to murder for her has got to be a pretty persuasive person. So I knew that that would be a problem. In my experiences prior to trial with Mary Ellen Samuels in court, she always presented herself as the average housewife, and there certainly was nothing sinister about the way she looked or the way she acted. So I believed that it maybe was going to be a tough sell for the jury, sitting there month after month, staring at this woman to believe that she was capable of the things that we were accusing her of.
Because of this concern, the prosecutors decided to offer Mary Ellen a plea bargain.
Don't know what you're talking about.
But the defendant swiftly turned down the offer.
But was it here? But I think she believed that she could manipulate the jury just as she had so many others. And I think she believed that she'd walk away free.
Prosecutors had no hard evidence in the case. There was no murder weapon or trace evidence. Robert Samuel's assassin and the man who hired him were dead. And with only a handful of circumstantial witnesses and the testimony of two confessed killers, Janice Morisi would have to work hard to show the jury how and why Mary Ellen had orchestrated these two murders. In March of 1994, Mary Ellen Samuels was brought to trial for the murders of her estranged husband, Robert Samuels, and suspected co-conspirator, James Bernstein. Mary Ellen Samuels was dubbed the Green Widow by the media when it was discovered that within a year of her husband's murder, she had spent more than $500,000 in insurance and inheritance money. Prosecutor Jan Marizzi would start day one of the Samuels trial with a flourish that would send a buzz through a hushed courtroom and send tabloid reporters rushing for the phones. While on a trip to Cancun, a boyfriend of Mary Ellen's had taken a photograph of her lying naked on a bed,
Smile.
covered with $100 bills.
Only.
Within days of the murder of her husband, Marizzi told the jury, Mary Ellen was out spending money, living the life of a queen.
I had that photograph blown up, and I showed that to the jury, and I told them why I was showing it to them. I told the jury that looking at her, she looks like the perfect, demure housewife lady who wasn't capable of such horrible crimes. And yet, this is a picture, a little bit of a picture into the glimpse of the soul of the real person, Mary Ellen Samuels.
Defense attorney Philip Namath, in his opening remarks, painted a different picture of the defendant.
You've heard her and what she's had to say.
She was a woman to be pitied,
Ladies and
framed
gentlemen.
by friends who owed her money, and hounded by a scorned detective who kept photographs he had found of
Make a
her
deal with
wearing
the devil.
lingerie.
And the deal is as follows.
Namath focused his attack on the foundation of the prosecution's case. He argued that the prosecution's witnesses had no credibility. He reminded the jury that most of them received immunity in exchange for their testimony. The deal, he explained, had motivated the witnesses to implicate Mary Ellen in the murder of her husband. A husband who had abused her and her daughter for years. Marizzi's first order of business would be to refute the defense's allegations of abuse by Robert Samuels by bringing Detective George Daly to the stand. During the investigation, he had questioned Mary Ellen about her relationship to Robert.
Yes, she said that she loved Robert Samuels and that they had a good relationship.
Daly also testified about Mary Ellen's response to questions about abuse.
I don't recall her specific statement, but I do recall her saying something to the effect that there was no abuse, no smacking around.
I have further questions.
One of Marizzi's next witnesses was Michael Taylor, a former sandwich shop employee and one of Melissa's high school friends. His testimony helped to reveal that Mary Ellen's murder plans were widely known among Melissa's peers.
Please state and spell your name.
Taylor testified to a conversation he had had with Mary Ellen's daughter Melissa prior to her stepfather's murder.
She turned around and said, well, you can't tell anybody this. So I said, okay, fine, whatever. And she said, my mom has somebody to kill my dad. Can you give me a gun? We need a weapon. Can you get me a gun? And I was just like, I couldn't believe that. I told her that, I couldn't.
In the defense's cross-examination, Namath attempted to impeach Taylor's credibility, questioning each event of that day. After 20 minutes of examination, it was clear that his testimony would hold up under scrutiny.
No further.
Marizzi called Mary Ellen's friend Jane Stevens to the stand. According to Stevens' testimony, Mary Ellen told her she had convinced someone to help her kill her husband.
She said she met him at Denny's and she was going to give him the money and he was going to be the hitman.
Did she tell you how much money?
She said $10,000.
Marizzi then probed into the details of the transaction,
Did she tell you anything about the payment?
Something in regards to what looked like advertising for the restaurant.
No further questions at this time.
Defense attorney Namath cross-examined Stevens, and when she admitted that Mary Ellen had loaned her $2,500 to purchase a car, it bolstered the defense's claims that the debt helped motivate her to implicate her friend. During the course of the James Bernstein murder investigation, Ventura County sheriffs interviewed Mark Johnson, learned that he had been the anonymous caller who provided the first link between James Bernstein and Mike Silva, implicating them both in Robert Samuel's death. The prosecution put Johnson on the stand. Johnson testified that one night he and his girlfriend had been riding in Bernstein's car.
You were driving?
When Bernstein's pager went off, Johnson read off the number, and Bernstein used his car phone to arrange a meeting.
We were going to be meeting someone.
Arriving at a gas station, Bernstein instructed Johnson and his girlfriend to stay out of sight.
And did you...
Johnson testified that he watched Bernstein walk across the road to the other car and speak with the driver. When Bernstein returned, Johnson inquired about the man's identity. Bernstein told him that the man's name was Mike Silva, and that he was the one who had killed Robert Samuels.
No further questions.
The prosecution next called homicide detective John Beerer to the stand. On the night Mary Ellen discovered her husband's body, Beerer testified, her behavior was somewhat unusual.
Did you tell the court and the jury about that incident?
Beerer explained that he was surprised at Mary Ellen's demeanor at the crime scene. In his opinion, she should have been more emotional than she was.
At one point,
She did not seem at all upset.
During that evening, did you have a...
Orisi next focused on a single incident that would help to illustrate Mary Ellen's apparent lack of grief. Beerer testified that while he was conducting a search of the house for evidence, just moments after the body of the victim had been removed, Mary Ellen had moved close to him.
She touched my head and told me that she likes bald guys.
Did you find this behavior unusual?
Very unusual. I've never had that happen to me in my entire life, on or off duty. Never.
Beerer was able to provide a first-hand account of how Mary Ellen seemed unaffected by the death of her husband. Because he was an officer of the law, there was little doubt as to the credibility of his testimony. However, one of the prosecution's next witnesses would be the most vulnerable to attack.
Many of the witnesses in the trial were testifying under grants of immunity, and that makes them somewhat suspect, as it should, to members of the jury. Unfortunately, when you prosecute cases like this, you don't often have credible witnesses who are a part of such a long, ongoing conspiracy.
Anne Marie Hamley, like many of Mary Ellen's friends, would turn on her in exchange for immunity from prosecution. She would testify that although she helped Mary Ellen arrange James Bernstein's murder, she attempted to distance herself from the killing by demanding that Mary Ellen provide the car.
What did you tell the defendant?
I told her that Paul wanted to get the job done. Then he wanted to use my car. I did not want him to use my car. And she wanted to get Jim killed. She had to have her car used.
And did she agree to let you use her car?
Yes. Yes.
No further questions.
Anne Hamley was actually given immunity for her testimony with regard to the James Bernstein murder because she clearly knew about the murder ahead of time, helped to facilitate it, helped to cover up afterwards. She was present when the two hitmen left her house with James Bernstein to carry out their plan to kill him. She was present when they came back without him.
In his cross-examination of Anne Hamley, defense attorney Philip Namath attempted to discredit the witness as a fair-weather friend who owed money to the defendant and turned on Mary Ellen in order to save herself.
Thank you.
After calling approximately 45 witnesses over a period of more than 3 weeks, the prosecution rested and the defense began to present its case.
I do.
Mary Ellen's daughter Melissa would waive her Fifth Amendment protection from self-incrimination and would take the witness stand in her mother's defense. Melissa, like her mother, would refute the testimony of former friends.
Yesterday, I believe it was, Miss Marizzi asked you why all of these people would lie either on you or your mother. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do.
Let me talk about a couple.
Namath asked Melissa if she knew of a reason why Michael Taylor would have lied.
Yes, I do.
What is that?
He stole money from the subway.
Melissa denied asking her school friends for a gun. She also denied telling classmates that she had attempted to make her father's assassination look like a burglary gone bad.
I count the money, and there's $200 missing.
Then the defense launched the attack the prosecution had been expecting. Mary Ellen's daughter told the court that she had suffered physical and sexual abuse at the hands of her stepfather, Robert Samuels.
Did there become a time when your father's abuse became something different than physical?
Yes, there did.
And can you tell me the first incident that happened and how old you were?
I was 13.
Melissa testified that her stepfather Robert had raped her 8 times between the ages of 13 and 18.
Come into my bedroom and I could...
According to
Hear him
Melissa,
come in, I'd pretend
Robert
like I was-
Samuels was a drunken monster in his own home, inflicting mental, physical, and sexual
He would come
abuse
into
on
my
her and
bedroom.
her mother.
The defense in the case seemed to be what we refer to in the profession as an abuse excuse. However, this was kind of a hybrid of that because it was, I was abused, but I didn't do it anyway. So it was a little bit unusual to have this defense presented that would suggest really that Bob Samuels and James Bernstein, for that matter, deserved to be murdered, and yet at the same time be saying that I didn't, in fact, murder them. I had nothing to do with it.
The climax of the trial came when the widow herself took the stand in her own defense.
The defense calls Mary Ellen Samuels to the stand.
Prosecutor Morisi knew she was about to face a cunning and experienced adversary. The widow's ability to manipulate people could persuade some of the jurors to sympathize with her and lead to her acquittal. A stunned courtroom had just heard the testimony of Melissa Samuels, whose allegations of physical and sexual abuse by her stepfather supported the defense's claim that Mary Ellen Samuels was the real victim in this case. On the stand, Mary Ellen Samuels described a horrific 6-year marriage in which she was beaten and raped by her husband. She left Robert to protect her daughter Melissa.
When he grabbed you and hit you that evening, did you have any bruises or marks the following day?
Yes, I did.
Can you describe the marks or bruises?
My arms were sore. I could hardly move them, and they were bruised. I didn't realize that I had black eye. It's the first black eye I've ever had in my life.
All right, no further questions. Prosecutor, your witness.
Prosecutor Jan Marizzi would turn Mary Ellen's own words against her with a letter she had written to her husband when she left him.
Where in this entire letter do you confront him with his abuse against you?
I didn't.
Marizzi began to attack Mary Ellen, claiming that the reason she had not written about her allegations of Robert's abuse was because she had invented them.
I didn't. That's not true. I didn't want to air out any dirty laundry on paper.
In one instance, she testified about a black eye that she had had, and she actually brought in a neighbor to corroborate that she had had a black eye. She blamed Robert Samuels for that black eye, but in truth and in fact, we were able to find out that she had just had plastic surgery, and that was the reason for the black eye.
Marizzi stayed on the offensive, questioning Mary Ellen about every time she told investigators that Robert had never been abusive to her or her daughter. Why, she asked, if the alleged abuse was occurring, did she fail to reveal that fact to the police? The charges contained special circumstances of murder for financial gain. If only one juror believed that Mary Ellen conspired to murder Robert because he was abusive, that would create a reasonable doubt which would deny a conviction for the prosecution. In the defense's closing argument, Namath submitted to the jury that the defense had proven that there had been both physical and sexual abuse. He also asserted that the prosecution's case should be based on physical proof, cold, hard facts, and the prosecution had none. In her closing, Marizzi told the jury that Mary Ellen had fabricated the stories of abuse in order to gain their sympathy. She explained that the prosecution had submitted enough evidence to show that Mary Ellen had conspired to commit 2 murders and that she should be held accountable for them.
This case does come down to credibility. And it is a matter of you deciding who you believe.
The jury would take those words into deliberations and consider them for the next 18 days. The wait was nerve-wracking, but the prosecutors knew that there were many complex charges to consider, and that would take time. Finally, the jury returned, declaring Mary Ellen Samuels guilty on 2 counts each of murder in the first degree, conspiracy, and solicitation. 2 days later, the jurors delivered their sentence: death.
I believe that Mary Ellen Samuels is where she belongs, on death row. I believe that the community is a safer place because she is there on death row. But it's not something that I take any particular joy over, because there are no winners when you prosecute these cases. There's just losers. There is loss and devastation that can never be overcome, particularly for the families and the murder victims. She can say goodbye to her family and her loved ones, and Bob Samuels and James Bernstein never got that opportunity.
There is a small but growing number of women on death row. Since California reinstated the death penalty in 1977, only a handful of women have been sent to Chochilla Prison, where female death row inmates are kept. Now, Mary Ellen Samuels would be joining them. In Buffalo, New York's East Side, a man is gunned down in broad daylight. Evidence at the scene is sparse, and police can do little to solve the latest in a string of murders. It would take a single witness and a massive effort to protect him for prosecutors to bring a notorious gangster to trial. As violent turf wars raged on Buffalo's east side, residents lived in fear of being caught in the crossfire. Witnesses refused to testify against a ruthless gang leader and his accomplices. The community needed someone willing to take a stand against the gangs. According to prosecutor Frank Clark, they found one.
They were selling dope and killing one another in order to gain tactical and business advantages. And this was the first time we had in a number of years a chance really to get in and prosecute a case, because we had a witness who not only saw everything, not only who was credible and articulate, but was willing to testify.
In the fall of 1988, the east side of Buffalo, New York was falling into the hands of gangs specializing in the sale of crack cocaine. When they attempted to take over the existing numbers rackets, a turf war broke out in the streets. On the afternoon of October 25th, on Kretner Street, a young man who lived in the neighborhood was helping a woman with her groceries.
How's Grandson doing today?
Oh, fine.
Two young men came around the corner. One fired 3 shots, and they fled the scene. The gunshots were heard by residents throughout the neighborhood. The woman who was standing next to the victim rushed into her house to call 911. The call was one of many received by the communication center of the 1st Precinct.
911, Buffalo Police, can I help you?
Callers reported that a man had been shot.
In the city of Buffalo, and a person has been shot. Is that person down? $11? What is the location? Oh, 911. I know what help, baby. Hold on, baby.
Police units were dispatched to the scene. When they arrived, police found a young man shot in the abdomen and chest. He was alive, but gasping for breath. A fire department rescue squad arrived a few critical moments later. As paramedics attended to the victim, police secured the scene. Detectives from the 1st Precinct arrived and were briefed by a uniformed officer at the scene. They began to question bystanders. Martha West was standing right next to the victim when the shots were fired. But she said she was getting a bag out of the trunk of her car when the victim fell. She never saw the shooter. Another man standing nearby did have some useful information about the shooting.
Right, sir. James Wright.
His name was James Wright. Married and a father to 2 young sons, the 41-year-old Wright told detectives that he worked as a custodian at a nearby church. He said he had been driving the church van delivering groceries to the elderly when he heard a scream. He also saw 2 men running down the street. He thought there had been a purse snatching, so he followed the men as they disappeared around a corner. But after pursuing the men for 2 blocks, Wright found himself staring down the barrel of a gun.
Right up to him and just shot him. Boom,
Wright
just
gave
shot him.
detectives a
Kept
description
running
of
on
the
down
2 men
this
he
way,
had followed from the
sir,
crime scene.
Two, mister. Two. It was 2 of them. Now
2 people coming to shoot.
Investigators learned that the wounded man was 25-year-old Larnell Cottrell. Under a parked car, detectives found a spent bullet. Paramedics had found another bullet when they lifted the victim onto the stretcher. Both slugs were copper-jacketed and were of the same caliber. Investigators met at the first precinct to discuss the case.
Have we checked with the mailman or anything else? Has anybody been in the area? It was a daytime shooting?
It was a daytime shooting. It'd be a good idea with the
The
mailman.
victim, Larnell Cottrell, had died at the hospital, and the suspects who fled the scene were now wanted for murder.
They have been debriefed.
Would it appear to be a large caliber weapon as we've had in the past?
Right now, it appears it's probably a large caliber.
Detectives reviewed the physical evidence at the scene
Type of wound we
and
haven't been
discussed
able to
possible
actually
witnesses to the
somebody
shooting.
That's right now. Mr. Wright is our only witness right now. We don't have much else going.
The detectives decided that for his own safety, James Wright should be questioned at the police station.
We can establish right now, so we'll have to see what we can do.
Wright agreed to come in for an interview with detectives. He recounted what he had seen and done earlier that day. Amazingly, Wright had memorized the license plate of the car belonging to the two men he had followed. When police ran the license number, they discovered it was registered to a woman believed to be the girlfriend of one of East Buffalo's most dangerous criminals, Donald Sly Green. The detectives now suspected the murder was gang-related. They showed James Wright a photo lineup and asked him if he could identify either of the two men he had seen. According to Detective Daniel DePiro, he immediately pointed out Sly Green.
And he went right to the picture of Sly Green. He didn't waver, he looked at it, and that's him. And that was Sly Green, which stunned the both of us, myself and my partner. It just doesn't happen that quick.
The day after the shooting, investigators found another witness who said he could identify Cottrell's killer. A janitor from the holding pen, one flight above the homicide office, had spoken to Stephen Brown, an inmate at the jail, and learned that the prisoner had witnessed the shooting. Detectives DePiro and Grabowski interviewed Brown. He told them he was on the street at the time of the shooting and saw the man who pulled the trigger. The killer was Sly Green, he claimed. But Brown's background made him a questionable witness. Investigators knew Brown was a drug addict with an extensive criminal record who had been arrested that afternoon for shoplifting. It was clear to investigators that James Wright's testimony would be crucial if they were going to make their case. Based on Wright's photo identification, a warrant was issued for Sly Green's arrest. Green was well known to police. He was the leader of a gang known as the LA Boys. Now 29 years old, he had been in trouble with the law for nearly 2 decades. At the age of 14, in his East Buffalo neighborhood, Green and an accomplice entered a grocery store late one night and robbed the clerk at gunpoint. On the way out of the store, Green shot and killed the woman. He would spend only a year in a juvenile detention center for the murder. At age 16, an armed bank robbery attempt would send him to a state prison for 10 years. After his release in 1984, Green went back to a life of crime. He returned to Buffalo to join his brothers Clayton and Gary Green. Together, they organized the LA Boys. With suspected connections to Los Angeles gangs, the LA Boys soon controlled much of the illegal drug trade on Buffalo's east side. As the violence increased, East Side residents became more fearful. Violent crimes were becoming commonplace, but investigators were finding little evidence to solve them. At the Cottrell crime scene, 2 spent bullets had been discovered on the ground near the victim. A third was recovered from the body during an autopsy, confirming statements made by witnesses who said 3 shots had been fired. Forensic firearms experts examined the bullets using a stereo microscope. Tests indicated the bullets that killed Cottrell were all .41 caliber, most likely fired from a Smith & Wesson revolver. But the gun had not been found. Detective Sergeant Daniel Rich was part of the evidence collection unit that processed the crime scene.
We did look for the gun in the area. The witness told us that the perpetrator had run down the street, and police officers combed the area, as well as myself. We did not come up with a gun.
Investigators did, however, find the getaway car. Police recovered the vehicle, abandoned a few blocks from the crime scene. The car was examined by forensic specialists from the Buffalo Police Department. The results were disappointing. To Erie County Assistant District Attorney Joseph Maruzak, this made the eyewitness testimony of James Wright even more important.
We find the car, the police find the car later that day, but it's wiped clean. There's no forensic evidence, there's no fingerprints, no nothing. But we know of Wright's ability to make an identification.
Armed with James Wright's testimony, prosecutors were anxious to put Donald Green in custody. In addition to his illegal drug activities, the leader of the LA Boys was suspected of involvement in prostitution, gambling, and even kidnapping. But authorities never had enough to convict. He seemed untouchable. Deputy District Attorney Frank Clark hoped this time would be different.
With Wright, we had a chance to finally make inroads on this kind of gang war that was going on.
And this is the car he would see. I had to have it.
With a victim in the morgue and a witness willing to testify, the Erie County District Attorney's Office wanted this to be the case that would put Green away. The office helped the police launch a massive search for the killer.
There was a manhunt of unparalleled proportions for him in Buffalo. And the Buffalo Police Department scoured the east side of Buffalo for days and months looking for Sly Green. Missed him on a few occasions. We would get tips, constant anonymous tips as to where Green was. We'd go and we'd look, wouldn't be able to find him. Come to find out later, we were just a few steps behind him.
One night within a few weeks of the murder, investigators spotted Green's Mercedes parked in front of the home of one of his known associates. Detectives staked out the house. They were disrupted when a TV news van monitoring police scanners arrived on the scene. Their cover blown, police immediately raided the house. If Green had been there, he was gone. Authorities were getting frustrated. The longer it took to apprehend the fugitive, the more difficult it would be to catch him. And the prosecutors feared that Sly Green's reign of terror would continue. On the gang-infested streets of Buffalo's tough East Side, Larnell Cottrell was gunned down in October of 1988. Police had little physical evidence, but they did have an eyewitness to the murder. James Wright, a church janitor, had picked notorious gang leader Donald Sly Green out of a photo lineup the day of the shooting. Months after Cottrell's murder, investigators still hadn't caught the fugitive. As the manhunt continued, First Precinct officers were briefed on Sly Green and his gang, with information pulled from dozens of case files. On the East Side streets, detectives spoke to an informant. The informant said he didn't know where Sly was, and no one had seen him for weeks. But the informant said Cottrell's murder was an act of revenge. Cottrell was involved in a numbers racket, he said, and his murder was the latest in a series of killings that dated back several years. The string of killings began in 1986, when a young man named Devotee Pompey was shot to death in an East Side alley. At the time, police suspected that Samuel Green, Sly's younger brother, was the hitman. Samuel Green was arrested for the murder. Police learned the murder victim had worked for an underworld numbers racket. And word on the street was he'd stolen $20,000 from his employers, who in turn hired Samuel Green to kill him for the theft. After his arraignment, Green was released on bail. A few days later, he too was killed. His body was found in the front seat of his car, shot in the head. A police informant said that Samuel was killed after he threatened the bosses who had ordered the hit on Pompey, saying he would tell the police what he knew unless they gave him more money. The investigation revealed that the murders of Devotee Pompey and Samuel Green marked the beginning of a gang war between the numbers racket and Sly Green's LA boys. Over a 2-year period, this war left as many as 8 unsolved murders in its wake.
What you guys doing? All right.
Detectives believe the latest casualty of the gang warfare was Larnell Cottrell, also suspected of involvement in the numbers racket. And the latest murder suspect was Sly Green.
Green had indicated that he was going to get even somehow, that there was a history there that made the shooting something which was not without motive. The motive was plainly revenge.
Detectives may have pieced together the motive for Cottrell's murder, but they still weren't any closer to finding their suspect. Sly Green continued to elude police for months. Finally, detectives got a lead on where Green was hiding. According to an anonymous tip that came into Buffalo police, Sly Green was in Atlanta, Georgia. Authorities in Buffalo asked for help from the FBI to bring in their fugitive. Assistant District Attorney Joe Marusak was determined to bring Green to justice.
And eventually, as a result of some information developed by them, and I believe Buffalo police, were able to track down Green coming out of a fast food restaurant in Atlanta, Georgia.
In February of 1989, almost 4 months after the murder of Larnell Cottrell, FBI agents intercepted Sly Green as he was strolling down a city street and arrested him without incident. The notorious Sly Green was finally in custody. The leader of the LA boys was returned to Buffalo to face murder and weapons possession charges. Green was held without bail to await trial. With the suspect in custody, the Erie County District Attorney's Office prepared to prosecute him. The cornerstone of their case would be witness James Wright.
He was a witness every prosecutor just dreams for. Conscientious, reliable, family man, no criminal record. It's somebody who, if you talk with him for a while and get to know him, you can tell he couldn't tell a lie if he wanted to. So you want the jury to see James Wright. And the more they see him, the more they're going to like him, the more they're going to respect him, the more they're going to rely on him.
In the months leading up to the trial, prosecutors were concerned that Wright, like many fearful witnesses in previous cases, could change his mind and decide not to testify. If that happened, the case against Sly Green would not even make it to trial. Late in August 1989, 6 months after Sly Green's arrest in Atlanta, James Wright contacted the district attorney's office. He had startling news.
Again, I want to thank you for coming forward.
Wright explained he had been repeatedly threatened by Garland Kaiser, a known member of Sly Green's gang, and there had been several attempts made on his life. Somehow, the LA boys had found out the identity of the prosecution's key witness.
Just encountered a drive-by.
There was an oversight, a slip-up, as there is in any investigation. I mean, nothing is ever perfect. If someone wants a crime report about any incident, really, they can go to the Buffalo Police Department, at least they could at the time, and for 25 cents, get a copy of that report.
Authorities later determined that an investigator working for Donald Green had picked up a copy of the report listing James Wright as a witness in the case. Soon after that, the threats and attacks on Wright and his family began. Afraid to go to the police for fear of reprisals against his family, Wright kept silent for months. Now he detailed a series of increasingly frightening encounters beginning in June, when Kaiser knocked on his door late one night. Kaiser warned Wright that he knew Wright was planning on testifying against Sly Green. Unless he changed his mind, he and his family would be in grave danger.
Tell me again what it was you saw.
A few days after his encounter with Kaiser, Wright was awakened around 4 a.m. to find his car had been firebombed. A few nights later, he heard a crash against a window in his son's bedroom. He found an unexploded Molotov cocktail outside on the ground. Then, on another evening, gunshots rang. Wright discovered bullet holes in a bedroom wall and a closet.
Look at this. Look at this.
One bullet had come within inches of his son's head.
Look at this.
In July, Kaiser and 2 other men spoke to Wright outside the church where he worked.
How you doing today, Mr. Wright? Doing all right, sir.
They questioned him about the day of the killing. Intimidated, Wright told them what they wanted to hear. That he could not identify Sly Green as Cottrell's killer. As the men were leaving, Kaiser handed Wright $100, a reward for cooperating. He at first was unwilling to accept it, but Kaiser insisted, telling Wright that refusal would put him and his family in more danger. He reluctantly took the money. Several weeks passed without an incident. Then, on the morning of August 28th, as Wright was driving his wife to work, they were the victims of a drive-by shooting. Wright was cut by broken glass. His wife was unharmed. It was time to go to the authorities.
You know, he was more angry than he was scared. I mean, he was scared, make no mistake. But he was angry. He was angry that they would try to do that to him. He was angry about how it had upset his life. He was angry at me because somehow he looked to me as though I had let him down. If you'd been doing your job, Clarky, this wouldn't be happening. And it was very difficult because I wasn't exactly sure what we were going to do myself.
The district attorney's office arranged to move the Wright family out of Buffalo. The prosecutors could only hope that Wright and his family would be safe until the trial, and that the LA boys' tactics to keep the witness quiet wouldn't work. Prosecutors in Buffalo were preparing for the murder trial of Sly Green, the suspected shooter in the 1988 murder of Larnell Cottrell. The key witness in the case, James Wright, had already survived attempts on his life by the LA Boys, the gang headed up by Sly Green. The Wright family was relocated to a relative's house at an undisclosed location outside the city. But soon, police learned that the Wrights were still in danger. According to an informant, the Wrights' location had been leaked, and members of the LA Boys were out to kill the witness before he could testify.
We were getting information from a couple of different sources that they had hit teams out to kill him. A team of Crips out of Los Angeles that were going to come, another group supposedly from Buffalo that had a contract out on him.
Days after they had moved in, the police discovered the gang's plan and relocated Wright and his family to a hotel. Citing the attempts made on the lives of James Wright and his family, prosecutors petitioned the court for the earliest possible trial date. The judge agreed, and an early trial date was set. The defense also petitioned the court to disallow Wright's testimony. Again, the judge ruled in the prosecution's favor.
Court's adjourned.
The rulings were victories for Assistant District Attorney Joseph Maruzak.
Without James Wright's testimony, Sly Green doesn't get indicted, doesn't go to trial, doesn't get convicted. It's that simple. Without James Wright, we have no prosecution.
Sly Green was represented by one of the top defense attorneys in Buffalo, Paul Cambria.
I believe that Donald Green did not murder this individual. Obviously, someone was murdered, and they were murdered for a purpose. Probably did have to do with the drug trade that was going on the east side. It just wasn't Donald Green.
To secure an acquittal, the defense would have to destroy James Wright's testimony on the stand. On October 31st, 1989, 1 year after the shooting death of Larnell Cottrell, the murder trial of Donald Green began. Security at the Erie County Courthouse was at an all-time high.
The security was beyond anything that I had been associated with previously. And every step, every precaution was taken to ensure that no harm came to James Wright.
Snipers were placed on a roof overlooking the courthouse. A metal detector was installed in the lobby, and armed guards searched everyone entering the courtroom. The defense attorney believed the highly visible security measures were excessive and would prejudice the jury against his client.
So by the time we got to trial, this is the image that was seared into the minds of all of these potential jurors that we were going to have in this case, that this was the worst individual who has ever been in our community.
The jury would hear brief opening statements. The state's case, the prosecutor said, was built around the eyewitness testimony of James Wright, who had identified Sly Green from a police photo lineup hours after Larnell Cottrell's murder.
You didn't go to the best schools.
While there was no forensic evidence linking Green to the shooting,
The eyewitness identification.
the prosecutor told the jury that the circumstantial evidence in the case, as well as the testimony of Stephen Brown, would corroborate Wright's identification of the killer.
It was a street execution with one reliable eyewitness and not much physical evidence. In fact, no forensic evidence that connected Sly Green to this murder. None whatsoever. So it was a lot of circumstantial evidence and James Wright's identification.
Now, you described to us that you saw the defendants.
The prosecution told the jury the circumstantial evidence included the fact that the men Wright followed were running away from the crime scene. the bullets found at the scene matched the type of gun they pointed at Wright, and the abandoned car matched the one Wright had seen them drive away in. In opening statements for the defense, Green's lawyer emphasized to the jury that there was no direct evidence linking his client to Cottrell's murder, and that James Wright's identification was wrong. Eyewitness testimony, the attorney explained, is very unreliable.
Case, which you may have read about in the paper.
Well, we knew that it was going to be an eyewitness case, and it was going to be a matter of eyewitness identification. And unfortunately, the public at large thinks that eyewitness identification is a very reliable kind of way to identify people, but it's probably the most unreliable. And so it's the kind of case where you realize that it's unreliable testimony, but you also realize the perception by people in general is that, you know, when somebody says that's the man, that they really know what they're talking about. But if you think about it, how many times have you thought that you saw a friend of yours who you've known your whole life, and then you go up and tap them on the shoulder and they turn around and it turns out to be a total stranger and you're embarrassed? But just prior to that tap, if someone would have asked you to bet everything you owned on whether or not that was the person, I'm sure you would have said that it was. And the problem is that eyewitness identification is very unreliable. But that was the whole core of this case.
Flanked by 8 sheriff's deputies armed with shotguns and automatic rifles, the prosecution's first witness, custodian James Wright, took the stand.
Left hand on the Bible, right? Do you promise to tell the truth, the whole truth?
For the first time since the day Larnell Cottrell was shot, Wright found himself face to face with Donald Sly Green. Wright's testimony took hours. Under direct examination by the prosecution, he told the jury what he witnessed the day of the shooting.
Right. Now, you
he testified that he was dropping off groceries in the neighborhood when he heard a scream. Seeing 2 men running away, he followed them in the church van he was driving. He pursued the suspects around a corner. Just as they were getting into a car, one of the men doubled back. Wright found himself staring down the barrel of a loaded revolver.
Come on, let's go! Come on, let's go! Come on, come on, come on!
So he's pointing the gun at you. What'd you do then?
Well, I motioned don't shoot. There's nothing else I could do. I mean, he just was staring at me, and I was staring at him, and he was still staring at me, as if to say, don't you come another foot farther. And I was just sitting there saying to myself, I'm going to remember this day for the rest of my life.
When you say he had a gun on you, what do you mean?
He was pointing it at my head. He just pointed it at me, just like that, you know.
You see the person in the courtroom today that pointed the gun at you?
Yes, I do.
Can you tell us where he is and describe an article of clothing that he's wearing?
He's wearing a suit.
Where is he?
He's sitting down next to the gentleman up front. Can I point at him?
Yes, you can.
That's him. That's him right there.
Thank you, Mr. Wright.
Wright also gave a description of the Ford Escort the defendant used to flee the scene.
No further questions.
With the prosecution's case hinging on Wright's testimony, defense attorney Paul Cambria's strategy would be to convince the jury that although the prosecution's key witness, James Wright, was an honest and brave man, his testimony was dead wrong.
We had to be very careful with Mr. Wright because, you see, he had presented himself as, I'm just a poor custodian in a church and I just happened to be driving by. I thought there was a purse snatching. I was a good Samaritan. I got involved. And so, you know, you can't exactly beat someone like that up. I mean, that's a counterproductive move. On the other hand, it's important to show that he's committed himself to an ID, but he's committed himself erroneously to an ID.
The defense attorney drew the jury's attention to discrepancies in Wright's testimony.
I would say about
Wright said it wasn't raining the day that this happened, and everybody else there said that it was raining. They all said it was raining, it was drizzling, it was fogging, and all the rest of it. Wright says it was, totally dry that day. He has the person who's doing it short. The other people say it was a tall, slim individual.
Thank you.
The prosecution would counter the defense's attack on Wright with the testimony of their next witness, who would corroborate Wright's identification of the killer. The prosecution called Stephen Brown to the stand. Brown told the court that he was on the street the day Larnell Cottrell was killed.
Show up to work on time, okay?
He said he had witnessed the
Became a
shooting.
witness.
Brown testified that he saw two men walk up to the victim. One of them fired at least 2 shots, and the victim fell to the ground.
You became a witness in this case.
After the shots were fired, he said, he went to his girlfriend's house before police arrived on the scene. Brown backed up James Wright's assertion that Donald Sly Green was Cottrell's killer. Knowing the defense would attempt to discredit their witness, the prosecutor established that despite Brown's known drug addiction and a recent arrest for shoplifting, he had not made a deal with the prosecution in return for his testimony.
Did you color your statement in any way?
Brown went on to testify that he had in fact pled guilty to the shoplifting charges and was sentenced to 60 days in jail. Brown was cross-examined by the defense, who pointed out that he had not come forward until after he had been arrested for shoplifting. The defense did not dispute that Brown was at the scene, but they claimed he arrived after the police were there and had learned more about the crime by watching the newscast that evening. His testimony, the defense claimed, was a calculated lie, constructed by a street-savvy criminal who knew how to work the system. Police officer Carl Thompson also testified for the prosecution.
Raise your right hand, place your left hand on the Bible.
The Buffalo Police Department's evidence collection unit had been unable to place the defendant in the getaway car through fingerprint analysis.
Yes, sir. 3 years.
But Thompson testified to having seen Sly Green getting out of the car a few days before the shooting. Thompson's testimony connected Donald Green to the same vehicle that Wright had identified as the getaway car on the day of the shooting. As the trial continued, prosecutors had growing concerns about the state of mind of the jurors. The forewoman had told the judge that some of the jurors did not want to be in the same room with Green. Even in a court of law, Donald Green was able to strike fear into the hearts of 12 strangers. The prosecution hoped that fear would not keep the jurors from rendering a guilty verdict in the case. By late November of 1989, the trial of Buffalo gang leader Donald Sly Green was drawing to a close. He was charged with the murder of Larnell Cottrell. For both sides, the case rested on whether the jury believed the testimony of a church janitor.
And you'll see.
James Wright was the prosecution's key witness. He testified that he saw the suspect fleeing the crime scene moments after the shooting. In closing arguments, the defense reminded the jury that there was no forensic evidence linking his client to the shooting, and asserted that James Wright, while a courageous man, had wrongly identified Green.
Well, Wright was mistaken. There's no question that at some point in time he was threatened, no doubt about it. But there's also no question in my mind that he was mistaken.
I ask you simply
In the
this.
prosecutor's closing statement, he reminded the jury that the testimony of the state's key witness, James Wright, had been corroborated by an eyewitness to the murder, as well as by the circumstantial evidence in the case. The jury's decision would hinge on whether they believed James Wright.
James Wright was without a doubt, the most critical, essential witness to the entire case. He was the linchpin for all the evidence.
Following the closing statements, the jury was sequestered to decide the guilt or innocence of Donald Sly Green. During deliberations, the jury forewoman made an extraordinary request. She sent a message to the judge asking that the defendant not be in the courtroom during the reading of the verdict. Judge Timothy Drury.
This is a man whose his personality became obvious to the jury. The type of person he was became clear to them. And although he was quiet and restrained during the trial that they observed, during the trial itself, they understood what he was like.
Judge Drury declined the jury forewoman's request, though he said he understood the anxieties that prompted it. After only 6 hours, the jury had reached a decision.
Will the defendant please rise?
They found Donald Sly Green guilty of second-degree murder in the October 1988 shooting of Larnell Cottrell.
Court's adjourned.
Green received the maximum sentence, 25 years to life. Sly Green's attorney would appeal his case to the Appellate Division of the State Supreme Court, arguing that the jury had been prejudiced by heavy courthouse security, as well as news accounts of the trial. The higher court rejected the appeal. In the wake of the trial, Erie County Deputy District Attorney Frank Clark appealed to the U.S. Department of Justice to have the Wright family admitted into the Federal Witness Protection Program.
And in my opinion, the only way that we would ever be able to ensure the long-term safety of this family was to get them into the program. And my initial overtures were met with sympathy, but no practical response because there was no federal connection. This was a state homicide, and it had no federal ramifications at all.
But when Clark argued that Wright may need to testify if Sly Green were later charged with federal crimes, Wright and his family were accepted into the program. Green began serving his 25-year prison term, but authorities were still keeping close tabs on him. They suspected that he was still directing the operations of the LA boys, even from behind bars. Sly Green was in prison for murder, but authorities in Buffalo suspected that he was still controlling the activities of his gang, the LA boys, from behind bars. The district attorney's office called in the FBI. Wiretaps were placed on the prison phone Green used. The FBI quickly determined that Green was still at the helm of his gang, giving orders to subordinates, orchestrating cocaine and heroin deals, plotting kidnappings and other crimes, all from behind bars.
He was in complete control of that organization from prison as though he had never left. Organizing, ordering, controlling, demanding, in every bit as direct a fashion from prison as he did from the streets. They didn't do a thing without his approval.
In one instance, gang members kidnapped a local store owner.
Time for you to pay up. Open the door. You're collecting too much. Get in there.
On telephone orders from the imprisoned Green, the kidnappers released the man after they received $25,000 in ransom. And it was all on tape. Investigators learned through the wiretaps that Sly's wife was heavily involved in gang activities. FBI documents showed that she helped her husband run the operation, setting up three-way phone conversations for him and his associates. The wiretaps also revealed that she even encouraged her husband to order the murders of 2 drug associates, one of whom was Sly's own brother, Clayton Green. Federal investigators were surprised to learn that Judy Spidell Green led a double life. By night, she was a major underworld figure. By day, She was a social studies teacher in Buffalo's public school system. On July 9, 1992, 26 members of the LA Boys, including Donald Green, his wife Judy, 2 brothers and other relatives, were indicted on federal charges related to drugs, racketeering, and gang violence. The indictments covered 73 counts and were based on more than 900 FBI tapes and some 6,000 pages of documentation. Within weeks of the federal indictments, the Green family empire began to crumble. Sly's relatives, friends, and associates began accepting plea bargains, agreeing to testify against the once mighty leader of the LA Boys gang.
Prosecution, would you please present your first witness?
Now safe in the federal witness protection program and far away from Buffalo, James Wright returned to testify once more against Sly Green, the man he helped put away for the murder of Larnell Cottrell. He recounted his meeting with gang henchman Garland Kaiser.
He wanted to know why I was testifying against Mr. Green when Mr. Green had never done anything to me. He told me they would do a ride-by on me. He told me that he watched my son ride his bike to school every day. And how would I like it if they shot him?
Wright recounted the threats he received, the attacks on his home, the firebombing of his car, and the gunshots that had narrowly missed his son's head.
After that, I went to church. I went to church and I brought back 4 metal chairs and lined them up around my son's beds to stop the bullets.
In March 1994, Donald Sly Green was found guilty on 26 counts and sentenced to 4 terms of life imprisonment with no chance of parole. In 1 year alone, 22 members of the LA Boys pleaded guilty to an assortment of felony drug charges. Finally, the LA Boys' hold on Buffalo's east side had been broken.
It all goes back to James Wright and his unbelievable and unparalleled, and at least in my experience, courage to just risk his life, his wife's life, his children's life, and stand up and say, okay, I'll lose everything I have in Buffalo. I'll leave my family, my parents, and everybody else, and I'll do this. And it's rare, it's uncommon that you'd ever see that from anybody. I don't know if I'd be willing to do that, but he did. And there's no question that the east side of Buffalo is safer as a result.
In October 1994, James Wright was awarded the Lou E. Peters Memorial Service Award for his courage and heroism in testifying against Donald Green. Although James Wright would never be able to live in Buffalo again, his courageous testimony had helped to transform the city's east side from a war zone back to a neighborhood once again. In the early 1980s, Miami was ground zero in a drug epidemic that was about to consume the entire state of Florida. Even small coastal communities like Charlotte County were not immune. Picturesque waterways became the entry point for drugs that would be distributed throughout the United States. Law enforcement found themselves overwhelmed, outmanned, and outgunned. But one prosecutor would dedicate himself to bringing drug dealers to justice. Assistant State Attorney Eugene Barry dedicated himself to stemming the flow of drugs. His friend and supervisor was Deputy State Attorney Donald Palekia.
He had a reputation here in this community of being a no-nonsense prosecutor, that he was going to do everything he could to prosecute anyone and everyone involved in drugs, whether they be sellers, traffickers, or users. He had no ambitions other than to be a good prosecutor. He tried a lot of cases. He was constantly in the courtroom trying cases.
Neighbors.
Gene Barry's ambition was to practice law. It was a dream he put off until later in life. He graduated from law school at the age of 41. Soon afterwards, he was hired as an assistant state attorney for Charlotte County, Florida. Barry had seen the effects of drug abuse in his own family. He was determined to use his position as prosecutor to fight the illegal drug trade. Between 1977 and 1981, he won convictions in 90% of his major felony cases. Drug smugglers took notice. They feared Gene Barry and hoped they'd never face him in court.
This is the coke charge, right? Yeah.
Saturday, January 16th, 1982. Gene and his wife Trudy were enjoying a peaceful evening at home. They were interrupted by a knock at the door.
The shots were very loud, I can remember that. There was a lamp on my right which blocked the door, so I couldn't see who had come in. And then I remembered to dial 911, and I told them that Gene Barry had been shot. Then I went and tried to get him to get up.
The first deputies on the scene approached cautiously. They found Trudy kneeling by her wounded husband. She was taken outside so deputies could make sure the attacker was no longer in the house. Paramedics arrived and urgently tried to save Barry.
I saw the paramedics go in with their little bag. And I thought, I'm going with him to the hospital. When they come out bringing Gene, I'm going with them. So I waited, it seemed like an eternity. They came out, but they didn't have Gene. They had their boxes, and that's when I really knew that he was gone.
The state attorney, Joe D'Alessandro, was informed that one of his prosecutors had been shot. He rushed to the scene with his chief investigator, Ralph Cunningham. Barry's supervisor, Donald Pellecchia, also rushed to the scene. Together, the three men decided that the state attorney's office would take over the investigation.
If a police officer gets killed, the police will turn over every stone on earth. We want to catch the person that killed him. I had a prosecutor killed, thought the same way. I want to catch the person that killed him.
While Trudy did not see her husband's assailant, she was able to provide investigators with a valuable clue.
I heard him say at the door, "Hello, how are you?" And his tone of voice was such that I knew it was a woman. You just know that. And that was all. That was the only word spoken.
What you found?
Yes, sir. If we look around, we haven't.
Investigators scoured the house for evidence.
The partner's still looking around.
Near the front door, they recovered 3 bullets, including one from the door jamb. Forensic examination revealed the bullets were .38 caliber wad cutters. The bullets are usually used for target practice because of their low cost and easy availability. For other reasons, wad cutters are also the bullet of choice for professional killers. The soft lead slug from the bullet often disintegrates on impact, taking with it important ballistic clues such as rifling. The absence of such clues makes it nearly impossible for a ballistics expert to link a bullet to a particular gun. And it ultimately deprives a prosecutor of a valuable piece of evidence to present to a jury. Barry's neighbors were questioned in the hopes that someone might have heard or seen something that could help investigators.
That night, they began to conduct a survey of the neighborhood to find out if any of the neighbors of Gene saw or heard of anything unusual, including gunshots. We were fortunate to have located some witnesses that could help us, which helped us pinpoint the time.
A local dentist happened to be driving in the area an hour before the murder. He later told police that he had noticed a female jogger near the Barry residence. The jogger was described as a white woman between the ages of 23 and 27, of medium height and build, with long dark hair. She wore a dark blue jogging suit.
If you could think of anything else, it's because
The description of the jogger was given to the press. Authorities hoped that the publicity would help to locate her so she could be questioned. When the press asked about a motive for the crime, investigators would not publicly conjecture.
Anything suspicious. I'm hoping that somebody's walking their dog or out jogging and saw something in the neighborhood.
Privately, however, they suspected someone in the drug trade, where Barry had made countless enemies. The list of suspects included anyone that Barry had prosecuted or was about to face in court. Chief Investigator Ralph Cunningham led the efforts to identify Barry's murderer.
Being a prosecutor, you had everybody that he's ever prosecuted, everybody that was involved in a case that may, hate him. It involved a lot of potential defendants amongst all those criminal entities. That made it very difficult. As we discussed, it took a long time to sort that out. Where normally you don't have that vast of suspects in a homicide.
Because what I want to do is I want to check.
With little evidence and nearly every criminal in Southwest Florida's drug underworld now a suspect, finding the killer would be a daunting task.
Check everybody.
Assistant State Attorney Eugene Barry was gunned down as he answered a knock at his front door. He was known for his relentless prosecution of drug offenders.
White.
Chief Investigator Ralph Cunningham began to think about a motive for the killing.
Our starting point was we thought it was probably a retaliation shooting. I had a team of investigators researching all the court files, all the cases that Gene handled. We'll get all the witnesses, all the co-conspirators, everybody involved in those cases, and we'll run them and see where they're at. Are they in jail? Are they out? And get all their names.
Among the many leads was a case that Barry would have prosecuted 2 days after the murder. It involved a small-time cocaine dealer named Stephen Taylor. When investigators sought to interview Taylor, they learned he had been in a car accident. He was currently hospitalized in Lexington, Kentucky.
Hi, excuse me. Can you tell me?
The Florida State Attorney's Office asked Lexington police to visit Taylor at the University of Kentucky Hospital.
Okay, room 110, that's down and to the left.
Come in.
When they arrived, they discovered 2 women visiting Taylor and asked them to leave.
Would you excuse us for a few moments, please? Thank you, if you could just...
They questioned Taylor about his whereabouts on the night of Eugene Barry's murder.
December 12th.
He said he had been at a local saloon where plenty of people saw him. Later that night, he had his car accident. It seemed like a good alibi. Lexington police reported their findings back to investigators in Florida.
I got nothing but alibis, okay?
Ralph Cunningham and his team noted the information and continued to study Barry's cases. Among the hundreds of past cases was one involving Mike Kelly.
Did you ever stop to think of all the lives of people you're changing?
3 months before Barry's murder, Kelly was convicted on drug trafficking and conspiracy charges for attempting to smuggle 17 tons of marijuana into Florida. Kelly was alleged to be part of a Kentucky-based drug cartel. He was sentenced to 45 years. At the time of the murder, Kelly was in prison. He was waiting for his appeal to be processed. When Kelly's jail records were studied, an interesting fact came to light. Mike Kelly and Stephen Taylor briefly served time in the same jail wing. Further investigation revealed that Taylor was able to get out of jail because Mike Kelly's wife posted a $12,000 bond for Taylor. Investigators found the connection between the Kellys and Stephen Taylor suspicious. They asked the Lexington authorities to question Mike Kelly's wife, Bonnie. Bonnie Kelly said on the night of Eugene Barry's murder, she was in Lexington. She discussed insurance with a man named Henry Vance, who could corroborate her story.
Yes, Kim.
Henry Vance was well connected in Kentucky's political circles.
Yeah, they've got the
He was a former aide to a governor.
conservationists. I think that they're pretty happy with that.
Currently, he was working for the House Speaker in the Kentucky legislature. He was also licensed to sell insurance. Henry Vance later corroborated Bonnie Kelly's story. Blocked by their alibis, investigator Cunningham tried to approach the investigation from another angle. He began profiling the type of killer he was looking for.
We would assume that the person probably came in from out of the area to do a hit. We really were a pretty peaceful community until the drug smuggling started. So, I thought that it would probably have been someone from out of town that came in.
If Cunningham's profile was correct, the killer would have had to somehow travel in and out of the area.
Do something.
They also would have needed accommodations.
So immediately, I wanted to know who arrived on any aircraft, for 48 hours before, who departed 48 hours afterwards. So we subpoenaed all the transcripts from all the airlines that came to Southwest Florida, which is thousands and thousands.
Cunningham also subpoenaed records from all the local car rental agencies.
We did the same thing with motels. Everybody that stayed in a motel, we got their name. And the idea was to put all these names together and then try to start correlating, some likeness, something that we could sink our teeth in. Probably the most complex project was to get all the telephone calls from all the phone booths between North Naples and Punta Gorda, Charlotte County, which is about 80 miles.
The subpoenaed records produced a staggering amount of data that had to be processed. Because the case involved a fallen colleague, all hands at the state attorney's office pitched in. Among them was Ed Gale, who worked in the intelligence unit.
I would be surprised if anybody there was putting in less than 18 hours a day. I'd be very, very surprised. That was probably the general rule.
Investigators were sifting through the reams of data looking for any suspicious activity or unusual patterns.
Really, we were looking for persons that we couldn't identify. We took all the people we could identify first that were legitimate. And then we had a few that jumped out that we never could run down. We had this Brenda Rankin that flew in, but we never could identify her. We couldn't see that she exists.
Investigators followed up on all suspicious coincidences. It was a painstaking task.
Okay, let's see if we can sum up.
As the state attorney's office processed the mounds of data, patterns emerged. Investigators discovered a series of phone calls from nearby Florida phone booths to the Lexington, Kentucky area. One call was made about an hour after the murder. It originated outside a Sarasota, Florida hotel. The number dialed was a Kentucky payphone within walking distance of Mike Kelly's home.
When we identified some of those calls, they came back to the Kelly group. So I felt quite confident at that time, very on early in the case, that they were involved.
The investigation now had a focus. Further analysis of phone records bolstered suspicions about a relationship between the Kellys and Stephen Taylor.
When we started getting our telephone records in, compiling those records, we were able to come up with calls to Mr. Kelly's home and calls from Mr. Taylor's home to Kentucky. We were able to then correlate, hook Mr. Taylor in with those calls.
Investigator Cunningham went to the Sarasota hotel. The hotel's clerks were shown photos of Mike Kelly's known associates. A hotel clerk recognized one of the photos. It was of Bonnie Kelly, Mike Kelly's wife. The clerk said the woman in the photo checked in under the name Brenda Rankin, a name which had also surfaced during a search of airline passenger lists, but had been unaccounted for. Investigators theorized that Rankin was an alias for Bonnie Kelly. The clerk also told investigators that a black man using the name Joe Rankin checked in with the woman. The hotel registrations with the names Brenda and Joe Rankin were taken as evidence. Bonnie Kelly was now a prime suspect. Investigators began tracking her movements throughout Florida. Their surveillance revealed she traveled with suspected co-conspirator Stephen Taylor and frequently used payphones.
Every time you would see Bonnie when we were surveilling her, she would always have this bag of money to pay for the phone tolls. And unbeknownst to her, every one of those could be traced.
The calls were traced to known drug dealers. Although the calls were traced, they were not recorded. Investigators guessed that Bonnie Kelly was seeking help from former associates of her husband, Mike Kelly. One of Kelly's calls was placed to a major drug dealer who used the name Curly. Curly allegedly supplied the 17 tons of marijuana at the center of Mike Kelly's conviction. Curly was certain that Bonnie's calls to him were being traced. He wanted no part of the intense scrutiny that comes with being involved in the murder of a law enforcement officer. He contacted investigator Ralph Cunningham. Their paths had crossed before.
Now, he strictly was a business person. He was a dope smuggler. But he had a family, and he didn't want anything to do with the murder. He also didn't want to end up being in jail for the drug smuggling thing. So he's seen a little window of opportunity to try to help himself by helping us.
Curly said Bonnie Kelly admitted shooting Eugene Barry, She wanted Curley to give her money so she and Taylor could flee the country. A deal was struck. Curley offered to set up a meeting with Kelly and tape it for investigators. In exchange, Curley would not be prosecuted on drug smuggling charges for the 17 tons of marijuana. Several meetings were arranged, but each time, Kelly backed out at the last minute.
I think she was afraid that maybe he'd have her killed. She wanted the money, but she knew she was flirting with danger. Anytime you're trying to extort money out of a drug kingpin, you know, it's not a good thing to do.
The information Curley provided about Bonnie Kelly was the first bit of evidence that directly implicated her in the murder of Eugene Barry. For his cooperation, he would not be prosecuted for the drug charges.
And we ultimately gave immunity for that dope deal. Told him, you know, he was getting a shot, once in a lifetime shot to walk away from. But if we seen each other again in South America, he could expect me to be shooting, and I would be expecting he was going to be shooting. So we just left on those terms.
That might be in question here.
The local dentist who had seen the female jogger on the night of the murder was shown 6 photos of various women, including one of Bonnie Kelly. The dentist could not positively identify Kelly as the jogger, but he did, however, say her photo was the one that most closely resembled the person he had seen.
Thank you.
The exhaustive investigation into the murder of Eugene Barry yielded 2 major suspects, but both had alibis. Surveillance revealed Taylor and Bonnie Kelly were now romantically involved. Field investigators waited for one of them to slip up or commit another crime. Meanwhile, other investigators compiled more circumstantial evidence against the 2 suspected killers. They hoped the suspects could be taken into custody before they obtained enough money to flee the country. Florida prosecutor Eugene Barry was murdered as he answered a knock at his front door. Bonnie Kelly and Stephen Taylor were the leading suspects in the murder. They knew they were being watched by authorities. They hoped to scrape together enough money to flee the country. Investigators needed more evidence to arrest them. They began by asking Lexington, Kentucky police to question the man who supplied Kelly's alibi, political aide Henry Vance.
He said that he met with her approximately 6:40 p.m. on the night of the shooting. Knowing what we knew about Bonnie at that time, it caused us to question his truth and veracity in the matter.
Bonnie eventually left Florida and returned to Kentucky. Investigators continued to keep Taylor under surveillance.
We decided that we would really key on Taylor, that he was a weak link. He was involved in the homicide. He knew what was going on. We know he wasn't a shooter. So at best, you know, he was in on an accessory before the fact, you know, before the homicide.
Then investigators got a break. They spotted Taylor with a concealed weapon. They followed him until he entered their jurisdiction and arrested him.
Taylor, let me see your hand. Once we got into our jurisdiction, we stopped him, and we got him carrying the guns, and we got him with some drugs.
With the new charges of illegal gun and drug possession, investigators let Taylor know he was a leading suspect in the Eugene Barry murder. the death penalty was a strong possibility.
There's Taylor.
Taylor and his lawyers sat down with Cunningham to try to work out a deal.
We had him in a tight spot.
I wasn't there.
He started off with his attorneys trying to negotiate a deal, a good deal for himself. I mean, he wanted to walk out of this thing completely. But I wasn't about to do that.
Taylor told the investigators that he knew the identity of the man who was with Bonnie Kelly on the night of the murder. He would not reveal more unless he would be given full immunity in the case.
At that time, I said, well, let's take a little break from our interview. And I went out in the hallway and went down to the library and made a phone call back to the command headquarters.
Cunningham spoke with investigator Ed Gale, who brought his attention to a suspect that investigators had been unable to locate for questioning. His name was Richard Holloman.
Initially, Holloman's name first appeared as being one of the persons that was spending a lot of time with Mike Kelly and Vance Taylor in the jail.
Ed Gale told Cunningham that he had recently found more evidence implicating Holloman as a co-conspirator.
Unbeknownst to most people, security at the airport go through the parking lot and record all license numbers of all cars once a day, approximately 11 to 12 o'clock at night, to see what vehicles are there, if there are any stolen vehicles, etc. When we were able to get those records and found a car there that was registered to Richard Holloman, so his name popped up there as being at the airport. And that was consistent with the time that Brenda Rankin came in on an airplane. We wanted to talk to Holloman, but he was nowhere to be found.
Look, I'm going to go back in.
Cunningham had a strong suspicion that Richard Holloman was involved in the shooting,
This is great.
but he needed evidence to confirm it,
Thanks, Ed. I'll give you a call, okay?
and he did not want Stephen Taylor to walk free.
I went back in and started our interview. I said, I'm giving you an opportunity to try to cooperate, to have some reduction in your time. You don't want to take that, all you're doing is lying. And his attorney said, oh no, he's telling the truth. I said, look, we have already taken a sworn statement from Holloman. We know who the co-conspirator is, and we're going to charge you with first-degree murder as a principal. Well then, dead silence. So I knew, well, we had him.
But by then the deed is done. What was I gonna do?
Cunningham's tactic worked, and Taylor agreed to cooperate in exchange for being allowed to plead guilty to second-degree murder, which could not be punished by the death penalty.
I didn't know what they were going to do.
Taylor explained that Kelly's initial target had been a woman who was working as an informant for the police.
The sheriff's department had used her, wired her up, and she went in and bought dope from drug dealers. Taylor was one of these cases, and these cases were being tried by Eugene Barry, and we had several of them in the system at that time. Absent the informant, you had no case.
But the informant was protected by police detectives and was being kept at a secret location. So Kelly decided to move on to her secondary target, Eugene Barry. Taylor revealed that he had staged the car accident on the night of Eugene Barry's murder.
I introduced him to Bonnie.
He told investigators that Henry Vance, the politically well-connected businessman, helped him to arrange the accident. Taylor also said that Vance provided Bonnie Kelly with more than just an alibi. He supplied the murder weapon. Vance allegedly instructed Kelly to use wad cutter bullets, which were harder to trace back to a particular weapon. The gun itself was said to have its serial numbers filed off, so it couldn't be traced. Kelly was also told to aim for the head and chest and to make sure Barry was dead before leaving the scene.
myself.
Stephen Taylor gave investigators new insight into the details of the murder plot,
I didn't know what they were going to do.
including information about Richard Holloman's involvement.
Holloman is...
Taylor explained that before he bonded out of jail, he met Holloman, who was serving 60 days for failure to pay child support. After Holloman was released, Taylor arranged for him to be Bonnie Kelly's driver while she was in Florida. In exchange, Taylor promised to make him part of his drug distribution ring. Investigators finally located Holloman and brought him in for questioning. They believed that while Holloman was definitely involved in the murder, he played a supporting role.
And once he realized he was just being used, and he was kind of at peace with himself and was easy to work with and very cooperative.
Holloman gave the authorities a sworn statement. He, too, pled guilty to the lesser charge of second-degree murder in exchange for his testimony. Holloman explained that he knew Bonnie Kelly under the alias Brenda Rankin. Stephen Taylor had never told him Bonnie Kelly's real name. Holloman was paid $1,000 for his driving services over a period of a few days. Investigator Cunningham flew to Kentucky and arrested Bonnie Kelly. Prosecutors were confident they had their killer. Kelly would face charges of first-degree murder for the death of Assistant State Attorney Eugene Barry. But prosecutors grew concerned about the credibility of their two key witnesses. Two criminals who were testifying to save themselves from the death penalty. Bonnie Kelly's trial began on April 29, 1983, a year and 3 months after the murder of Eugene Barry. One of the prosecutors was Gene Barry's supervisor, Deputy State Attorney Donald Pellecchia.
It was the most pressure that I've had as a prosecutor on a case. I can remember a few days before the trial, Ralph coming to me and said, "Don't blow this case. Don't lose this case." And there was no way I was going to go into the courtroom with anything but that pressure on me of knowing that everyone was counting on us to get a conviction in this case with the evidence that we had. And that was a great deal of pressure because he was a friend, because he was somebody that I worked with, and because he was law enforcement.
The case would be co-prosecuted by both Pellecchia and State Attorney Joe D'Alessandro. The prosecution presented a litany of witnesses who worked for phone companies in the area. The witnesses detailed calls made around the time of Eugene Barry's murder, from Florida payphones to Kentucky payphones.
That you asked me to look up.
Witnesses from airlines detailed passenger manifests that implicated Bonnie Kelly.
No, sir.
And the dentist who saw the female jogger on the night of the murder also testified.
I remember passing a jogger, and I noticed the jogger because it was really late, and she was wearing sunglasses.
But the defense questioned how he could be so certain of what he saw in the dark the night of Eugene Barry's murder.
Would you say it's fair, Dr. White?
The prosecution had presented its circumstantial evidence to the jury. They were concerned that the defense had poked holes in the testimony of the dentist.
Could have been somebody else.
Could have been.
Right.
Next, the prosecution would begin calling Kelly's alleged co-conspirators to the stand. The first was Stephen Taylor.
Swear to tell the truth.
Prosecutors were concerned about Taylor.
Yes.
They were unsure that his testimony would match the stories he told in his interviews.
I never felt comfortable with anything Taylor said until after he said it. I assumed that I would have the testimony he had given to me previously, but I was very, very worried when he was on the stand. He did testify the way he had told us he would testify prior to the trial.
Taylor testified that Kelly had discussed killing Gene Barry.
You know the defendant?
Yes.
The reason? She didn't want to see Taylor put in jail by the same prosecutor who had put her husband away for 45 years.
I don't know. I know why she said that she wanted to kill Gene Barry, because she hated him.
She hated him. Witness, Counselor.
Thank you, Your Honor.
The defense immediately attacked Taylor's credibility.
Mr. Taylor.
The jury
You
was
were
reminded
indicted
that Taylor
for
was testifying to get a lesser sentence.
You understand the difference, do you not, between first-degree and second-degree murder?
Yes, sir.
First degree carries the death penalty.
Yes, sir.
Second degree does not carry the death penalty.
Yes, sir.
And it was you, Mr. Taylor, who would have benefited
The
from the
defense
death
pointed
of
out
Linda
that
Bailey, was
he,
it not?
not Bonnie Kelly, would have benefited from the death of Gene Barry.
It was you, Mr. Taylor, who benefited, if you can call it that, from the death of Gene Barry.
Benefited?
Well, you got what you wanted. Your continuance was granted, wasn't it, Mr. Taylor?
That wasn't the reason. I didn't plan to kill Gene Barry.
You got your continuance by virtue of his death.
Of course it was continued.
And it was you and no one else, Mr. Taylor, except for you, that could have benefited from that death. Isn't that right?
I don't know why he was killed.
Nothing further, Your Honor.
Very well.
Next, the prosecution called Richard Holloman to the stand. He was the driver for Bonnie Kelly the night that Gene Barry was murdered. The prosecution hoped that the jury would find Holloman more credible than Taylor. With State Attorney Joe D'Alessandro questioning him, Holloman testified about leaving jail and being contacted by Taylor to drive Bonnie Kelly.
Yes, sir, it does. And I knew that he was paid.
Holloman testified that he picked up Bonnie Kelly, who was using the alias Brenda Rankin, at the airport. It was 19 hours before the murder of Gene Barry. Holloman said that she found Barry's address simply by looking it up in the phone book. They used a map to locate his house. As evening fell, Kelly donned a blue jogging suit and a dark wig.
Yeah, I'm ready.
She began a practice run to case the house. The prosecutors believe that's when the local dentist saw her as he drove by.
So what happened next?
With the practice run completed, it was
After
time for Kelly
gunshots
to
and
commit
you
the
had car
crime.
neutral in your...
So later that night, we drove back by there, and she put on the wig and she pulled out her gun.
What kind of gun was it?
I think it was a revolver. It looked like a snub nose. I mean, I didn't sign on to kill anyone. So I told her that, you know, I didn't want to do it, that I thought it was a bad idea, and she said that everything would be fine and she would take care of it. So she put on the wig and she got out of the car.
Holloman described waiting on a side street for Kelly to return when he heard gunshots. He started driving away when he saw Kelly in his headlights. Once in the car, Holloman said, Kelly described the details of the murder. She ran up to the front door and knocked. When the prosecutor answered, she shot him twice. As he tried to run back into the house, she stepped inside and fired the gun 2 more times.
Come on, get in the car! Come on!
Kelly began disposing of the evidence as they got further away from the scene of the crime. Holloman said he saw Kelly throw what he believed to be the murder weapon into a Salt Creek. While he did not see the gun, She told him that she needed to dispose of something in salt water.
Both of her and...
Investigators were not able to recover the weapon.
I agreed to drive her around.
Counselor?
The defense attacked Holloman's credibility, as they had done with Stephen Taylor.
Holloman, your memory of the events seems to be quite sharp, especially the point where Mr. Barry answers the door, almost as if you were there yourself.
I was not, sir.
Yes, that's been...
The defense also tried to show a close tie between Taylor and Holloman and their planned drug
You also
business.
have an arrangement, and you've known Mr. Taylor for a while, haven't you?
Yes, sir.
All right, where did you and Mr. Taylor meet again, please?
We met in lockup.
Right. Okay, and how long would you say you've known him? How long has that been?
I'd say maybe close to a year or so.
You talked about forming a partnership, right?
Yes, sir. And drugs.
Right. A Taylor-Holloman partnership.
He was leading, I was the seller.
Thank you, Your Honor. No further questions.
The prosecution next sought to counter the doubts raised by the defense's questioning.
The whole truth and nothing but the truth, so help you God? I do. Please be seated.
I want to show you a few documents that my office...
They called a document analyst with the crime laboratory of the Florida Department of Law Enforcement in Tampa.
Okay, I'd like to show you these three documents. Would you please examine them? Okay, what are those three documents?
These are three items that were sent to me that I have reviewed.
He analyzed known handwriting samples from Bonnie Kelly and the hotel registration she allegedly filled out with the name Brenda Rankin.
Are these the three documents?
The analyst testified that the address on the registration card matched Bonnie Kelly's writing sample, but the prosecution's hopes for conclusive proof were dashed. The analyst was forced to admit that he was uncertain if the signature on the hotel record matched her handwriting.
And you got down to this one point. Everything else was great, but this was the pivot. This made or broke it. And there was conflict in that testimony.
The expert's inability to state conclusively that the entire sample had been written by Bonnie Kelly may have raised some doubts with the jury. After presenting witnesses for 2.5 weeks, the prosecution rested.
Please, Your Honor,
The defense rested at the same time, presenting no case of its own. In the defense's final argument, they hammered away at the two cornerstones of the prosecution's case, the testimony of Taylor and Holloman. The jury was reminded of the questionable credibility of the Taylor-Holloman partnership.
This may be as momentous a decision as you will be ever having to make in your life, I'm sure. And would you make a decision, a business decision, based upon the representations of Mr. Taylor, of Mr. Holloman? I suggest to you, ladies and gentlemen, respectfully, that you would not. How then can you make a decision in this case based upon the representations of a Holloman-Taylor partnership? Respectfully.
The prosecution was scheduled to begin its closing remarks the next day. With his key witnesses under attack and doubts raised by the prosecution's own handwriting analyst, Joe D'Alessandro needed a break to shore up his case against Bonnie Kelly. Bonnie Kelly was on trial for the murder of prosecutor Eugene Barry. The prosecution was worried about its case because of the defense's aggressive cross-examination of witnesses. The credibility of key witnesses was now in question. The night before the prosecution was set to deliver its closing remarks, they stumbled upon a new piece of evidence.
I don't know, it was 2, 3 in the morning. And we just going over this pivotal point. And Ed said, wait a minute, I think I've seen that address. He goes in this box like a human computer, pulls this thing out.
It was the address of one of Bonnie Kelly's relatives. It matched the address written on the hotel's registration.
That'll work. We'll introduce this first.
And what did it was that address that was put on that, which turned out to be someone in Bonnie's family. And that substantiates that she made up that lie at that time.
In its closing remarks, the prosecution explained to the jury that when a person makes up lies, they tend to weave real experiences or knowledge into them. The fact that the address on the hotel registration was that of a relative of Bonnie Kelly's helped to bolster their claims that she was at the hotel just after Gene Barry's murder. The prosecution agreed with the defense that Stephen Taylor was a criminal and would have benefited from Gene Barry being murdered. But they emphasized that it was Bonnie Kelly's finger that pulled the trigger.
Eugene Barry.
The jury deliberated for 7 hours before finding Bonnie Kelly guilty of first-degree murder. The jury recommended a sentence of life in prison without parole for 25 years. In a separate hearing, Stephen Taylor and Richard Holloman received their sentences. The judge felt Taylor was more culpable in the murder than Bonnie Kelly and sentenced him to 99 years in prison. The judge praised Holloman's cooperation and sentenced him to 10 years in prison. 5 years of the sentence was suspended, leaving only 5 years to serve. Mike Kelly, convicted on drug charges, was released on appeal. Testimony from a key witness at his trial was ruled inadmissible. The final loose end in the conspiracy to murder prosecutor Gene Barry was Henry Vance. He allegedly supplied the murder weapon, and it helped to provide alibis for convicted killers Bonnie Kelly and Stephen Taylor. It took investigators 5 years, just before the statute of limitations was set to run out, to get an indictment on federal weapons charges. Henry Vance was convicted and received a 15-year sentence, the maximum sentence for the charge. Though the case was solved, Charlotte County and the state of Florida still mourns the loss of their dedicated prosecutor. The state of Florida created the Eugene Barry Award, given to the most outstanding state attorney who is not only skilled, but also cares about the community. The Gene Barry tragedy helps to remind the public that while police officers constantly put their lives on the line, prosecutors also face threats. And sometimes they pay with their lives in the fight for justice.